I'm Harvey Mansfield. This is a debate on post-election analysis. We're going to speak and listen until about 6:15. Then a light but delicious supper will be served in the concourse. And then we'll return to after an hour or so to have more questions, because we don't want anyone to have come without being able to ask a question. This event is co-sponsored by the Program on Constitutional Government and by CAPS, the Center for American Political Studies, both of them in the Great Gray Green Government Department. Program on Constitutional Government was founded in 1985 by Bill Kristol, you see, and myself, and Shep Melnick, now of Boston College. We have a motto, and our motto is to invite people who otherwise wouldn't be invited. So today, we're going to begin with our dynamic duo of Galston and Kristol. Galston speaking first. This is, I think, the 10th or maybe the 11th time that they have met. And it's been every 2 years since we got started. And we're just delighted to have it go again. They're two political philosophers who then have since have graduated into policy without leaving everything behind. Galston represents the victorious donkey, and Kristol, the defeated elephant. And they're joined by Michael McConnell, who was a professor of law at Stanford University. Let me say something about him. He graduated from the University of Chicago Law School. He's now Richard and Frances Mallory Professor of Law at Stanford and the Director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford and a Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Before teaching at Stanford and Chicago, he was on the 10th Circuit, a U.S. judge on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. So his writings don't merely consist of briefs or articles or books, though he's done all these things, but he's done decisions. In constitutional law, he has the leading textbook, and he's a specialist on the religion clause, freedom of religion clause of the First Amendment. Bill Kristol is the publisher and editor of the Weekly Standard, a magazine devoted to truth and the idea of the good. He got his PhD at Harvard because he has a PhD, writing on the political philosophy of the Federalist. And he's written books and many, many articles, especially recently, and is a philosopher with a policy career. He was a chief of staff for Vice President Dan Quayle, and he's been in the Department of Education, other parts of Washington, where he's now located. And William Galston, who's a senior fellow at Brookings. And are you still at Maryland, University of Maryland, or have you left that?
I'm still on the graduate faculty.
Still on the graduate faculty. He's more professorly than Kristol, although I should mention that Kristol has been a professor at Pennsylvania and the Harvard Kennedy School in his career. Bill Galston is the author. I always like to remind him of this, of his golden youth, of Kant and the Problem of History. And he's also written books on liberalism, justice and the human good. You could say that he's brought the wisdom of Aristotle to liberalism, as much as is possible and proper. And he served in the Clinton White House, where he was a very important deputy. So we're going to have them all speak for a while, and then they'll entertain questions. We want to begin with William Galston.
Well, thank you very much, Harvey, for this 10th or 11th invitation. And I must say that the motto, which I'd never heard before, explains something that had previously puzzled me. There will be lots of time to delve into the details of tactics, what campaigns did, what went right, what went wrong. That's not the purpose of these introductory remarks. I'd like to try to step back and ask a handful of broader questions very quickly. Question number one, what kind of election was this? And this is going to be sort of a pop American political development schema. Option one, is this an election that ratified a big change? My answer to that question is no. We know what those elections look like. They look like 1900 or 1936 or 1984, when the re-elected incumbent gets many more votes the second time than the first time and a larger share of the popular vote. Neither of those things happened in Obama's case. One of the underwritten stories of the campaign is how much overall turnout actually fell between 2008 and 2012. The returns are not yet in, but it is entirely possible that overall turnout in absolute votes will be below 2004 as well as 2008. So a mass mobilization this was not. Indeed, it turns out that Barack Obama was the first incumbent to be reelected with a share of the popular vote below his first victory since Andrew Jackson in 1928. This is unusual. A second aspect of ratifying elections is that the fundamental premises on which a change has occurred are endorsed by a supermajority of the public, and that didn't happen either. According to the exit polls, the people who cast their ballots a couple of days ago continued to be lukewarm at best about the president's signature domestic policy accomplishment, the Affordable Care Act, and with regard to what both candidates labeled as the mega issue of the campaign, namely the role of government in American society. Well, here again, there's a survey question in the exit polls that casts some light on that. The question, I paraphrase, is, should government do more to solve the nation's problems, or, option B, is government doing too much already that ought to be left to individuals or the private sector? In 2008, 51% said the government should do more, 43% said it's already doing too much. 2012, that was flipped precisely. Only 43% of the people now say that government should do more to solve national problems, and 51% say that government is already doing too much. That is not a strong predicate for a new surge of activist government. So here's the second kind of election it could be, a status quo election, and in some respects it was. I'll tick off the obvious points. The presidency didn't change party hands. Neither did the House of Representatives, which is remarkably unchanged from the previous one. Republican losses at this point are in single digits. It may crack 10, but not much. And the Democrats, somewhat surprisingly, picked up a couple of seats in the Senate. We can talk about that later, but once again, not a transformative change in the Senate. The basic structure of the party coalitions did not change. The division of partisan majorities between the states barely budged. Romney, in the end, was able to move only the two weakest Obama states, North Carolina and Indiana, into his column. nor did the partisan composition of the electorate change. As a matter of fact, if you put the Democrat-Republican independent split in 2008 up against the Democrat-Republican independent split in 2012, they're identical. Option number 3, was this a harbinger election, the sign of things to come? In a number of respects, again, yes. Let me begin with the much discussed issue of demography. Here are some figures that ought to strike terror into Republican hearts. The first set goes like this: 77, 74, 72. That represents the white share of the electorate in 2004, 2008, 2012, respectively. Here is the second set of terrifying figures: 44, 31, 27. That represents the Republican share of Latino votes in those 3 elections. We can now say that the Democrats have established a pretty solid beachhead in the Southwest, including not just New Mexico, but now Nevada and Colorado, principally on the strength of the surge of Latino votes. And the single biggest surprise, at least for me, on election night was Florida. I did not expect Barack Obama to hold on to Florida. Why did he hold on to Florida? Well, let's take a look. 2008, the composition of the electorate in Florida was 71% white, 13% African American, and 14% Latino. 2012, the 71% of whites had fallen to 67%. The 14% share of Latinos had risen to 17%, and Obama's share of the Latino vote had also risen from 57 to 60. That is more than enough to explain how Obama held on to Florida against the odds. A harbinger election also, in that young adults are steadily ramping up their share of the electorate, again, surprising a lot of people, including the current speaker, not Mr. Boehner, me, who, I expected, based on sort of qualitative research, namely talking to young people at Brookings, that young adult turnout would be down as a share of the electorate. I expected some real demobilization out of disappointment. That did not happen. Indeed, the young adult share of the electorate has actually ticked up a point from last time. The other big change, and this has not been reported, but I also think it's a harbinger, is the change not in the party composition of the electorate, but in the ideological composition. In 2008, only 22% of the electorate reported in the exit polls that it deemed itself and called itself liberal. In 2012, that rose to 25% versus 35% for conservatives. I haven't had time to do the research. I've been occupied with a few other things, as some of you know. But my impression is that that 10% gap between liberals and conservatives is one of the smallest gaps in quite some time. And once again, I think interesting, and I expect that to continue because young adults who are now moving into the electorate are disproportionately likely to consider themselves liberals. Okay, question number 2. Where does this election sit in history? And here are a couple of perspectives, very rough and ready perspectives. In the mid-1960s, we did 2 very big things that changed the nature of American society. We passed groundbreaking civil rights legislation, and we passed immigration reform, which, after 40 years of shut gates, reopened the gates of immigration and broadened the catchment area of immigration from traditional European venues to the entire world. The civil rights revolution had a much faster impact on American society and American politics than the immigration reform revolution. But I think we can now say that the immigration reform piece of it, the second shoe, has dropped, with consequences that I think are momentous for American society and politics. And The Democrats got for a very long time the political downside of the civil rights revolution before they managed to stabilize that, first under Clinton, then under Obama. But they are now getting the upside of the immigration reform revolution. Here's the second perspective, which is even more mischievous. As everybody knows, the failed Barry Goldwater election of 1964 generated a long march through the party and political institutions that eventuated in Ronald Reagan's nomination, his triumph, and then his re-election. Could one say that with a much longer lag, Barack Obama represents the full flowering of the McGovern insurgency inside the Democratic Party? There's a remarkable structural similarity between the coalition that the McGovernites dreamed of in 1972 and the coalition that Obama brought into majority status, into office in 2008 and again in 2012. Indeed, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to say that these are the first signs of a mass base for the liberal and progressive movement since the collapse of the New Deal coalition. Now, I've already said plenty to put that in a context where it has to be qualified, and excessive zeal or enthusiasm in that direction, I am convinced, will be fiercely punished by the electorate. But still, the immigration revolution has created, for various reasons, the first mass base in a very long time for progressive sentiments. Question number 3, the state of the Obama coalition. And it is, and this again has been underreported, but I think it's significant, narrower than it was in 2008. Now, in one respect, that's not surprising because Obama lost, according to the information now available, about 2.5 percentage points in his share of the electorate. But here are some of the things that went against him. His support among whites fell from 43 to 39%. Among moderates, from 60 to 56%. Among independents, from 52 to 45%. And his base is also narrower in the SES ladder. He did very well among voters from households making less than $50,000 a year, but in the heart of the middle class, households making $50,000 to $100,000, his support declined from 49 to 46%. And in the 100 plus, the upper middle class, from 49 to 44%. So a very, very narrow base for a slender majority. What about the Republican coalition? Well, speaking as a Democrat, despite the difficulties that I just enumerated, I would not change places with the Republican Party right now. Why not? Well, as has been widely noted in the past 48 hours, there are not enough white people to sustain the enterprise. And not only that, the shares of the electorate constituted by married couples and by religious believers is declining. I think it's fair to say that without fundamental immigration reform, there is a danger that the Republican Party will go the way of the California Republican Party after the politically disastrous governorship of Pete Wilson. I think the threat is that grave, and the need to get this monkey off the backs of the Republican Party is that urgent. A word about the social issues. I think we've learned a couple of things about them as well. First of all, the American people are perfectly capable of distinguishing between honorable pro-life sentiments on the one hand and what I'll call abortion extremism on the other. And they are perfectly capable of distinguishing between pro-life sentiments and anti-contraception sentiments. And neither of those issues cut very well for the Republican Party. Indeed, you might argue that abortion extremism, real or perceived, cost the Republican Party 2 Senate seats that it should have won very easily. And if you want to extend that argument, you could say that the combination, you could say that the Tea Party, broadly speaking, has cost the Republican Party 5 Senate seats at least in the past 2 cycles. That is to say, the difference, the difference between what would have been a majority if Romney had won and a 55-45 disadvantage. As for same-sex marriage, this is clearly a tipping point year on that issue. Not only the vice president and the president, but also for the first time after a very long string of defeats, a series of victories in statewide votes. This is a big deal. I think that unlike abortion, where there's no sign that the issue is going away, it's very clear in the long run which side will prevail and which side will wither away when it comes to same-sex marriage. Now, there are going to be some states that hold out because sentiments differ among the states, and I hope very much that this issue will be resolved at the state level. Nonetheless, it's clear which way the wind is blowing. You don't need to be a weatherman to tell. Okay, so finally, fifth and finally, where are we on what I will call the big issues? And first, a word about this election. This election was a missed opportunity to clarify those issues for reasons that I can speculate about but don't know for sure. Neither political party seized the opportunity to bring the American people into the actual conversation that's about to occur. And cynics say that's not what elections are for. Indeed, some of my colleagues at Brookings have been quoted as saying that. I beg to differ. So, but nonetheless, some things are tolerably clear. Whether or not the Republican Party likes it, the large legislation passed in Barack Obama's first term is now the law of the land. It is here to stay, and so the question is how they will adjust to it and how it will be implemented. On the Supreme Court, it's by no means clear that the president will get an opportunity to make a nomination. I'll defer to Mike McConnell on that, but if he does, it will not be in the model of the sorts of justices that Mitt Romney cited as his beau ideals. With regard to immigration policy, this is the one policy area where I think the ice may be breaking. It's clear that the Obama administration intends to put forward comprehensive immigration policy pretty early in the first year of the second term. And it's going to be a moment of truth for the Republican Party, and I suspect a lot of thoughtful Republicans are going to break ranks, whatever the leadership says. And I think the leadership may be intelligent enough to see the handwriting on the wall. Fiscal policy, well, there are only two options there, gridlock or compromise. And I think I can predict which one of them is going to happen if you just give me a minute. Yes. Care to pick? As we speak, this is the question du jour in Washington. Namely, will the warring parties, who do have fundamentally different views on how the fiscal challenge should be addressed, recognize that the American people are sick and tired of the gridlock and actually get off the dime and get to yes in some way, shape, or form? And if so, yes on what? I have lots of thoughts about that. I won't bore you with them now, but I can't say that the election clarified the fundamental choices that need to be made in that area very much. There's a little bit more daylight in the area of tax reform, which I think everybody recognizes is long overdue. We really haven't done it since 1986. The basic model is now very much in view, and there are some dissenters on the left and the right, but the idea of going back to the 1986 broaden the base, lower the rates model and do what's necessary within that framework, I think now commands not only the median, but one standard deviation either side of the median, and is likely to be the framework for these conversations. The Speaker of the House made a very interesting statement on that issue just yesterday, which is deliberately ambiguous, but I think comes closer to opening the door than to close it. But I have no idea what's going on inside his caucus, and he may not either. And then a couple of other large items. Whether or not we have the kind of public investment, the new surge of public investment that the president has called for, and the need for which I would defend, is very much dependent on a settlement of the fiscal policy questions that creates some space for that investment. And finally, with regard to energy policy, everybody knows what the president's preferences are, and everybody knows what the facts on the ground are. And the question is, how will those two come together in a way that members of both parties can in good conscience support? There's more to be said, but this is not the time to say it. So thank you very much, and I yield to the double bill.
It's good to be here. It's not quite as good as it was 2 years ago. I always look forward to this every 2 years, but I look forward to it a lot more like when there's a huge Republican victory, and especially when there's a huge Republican victory that particularly discomforts many people in this region. Like a 94 Gingrich victory or the Tea Party victory. That's a good time to come to Harvard, but this year not so much. But I'm still happy to be back. I'll try to be reasonably brief. I don't really disagree with much that Bill said, and I want to hear from Mike McConnell, and then we have dinner at 6:15, and we need to have a lot of time for drinks before dinner under current circumstances. So I'll approach it slightly differently than the way Bill did. Let me first explain why Republicans should calm down and not worry so much, and then I'll explain why maybe they should worry, and you can decide which of these arguments is more persuasive. In a way, they shouldn't worry. My fellow Republicans, and for those of you here who are inclined in that direction, or conservatives, shouldn't worry too much for the following reasons. Incumbents usually win. They've won, I think, 14 out of 18 times an incumbent president's been for the presidency. An incumbent president's been on the ballot since 1896. The people seem to generally prefer, in the presidential level especially, to keep someone for 2 terms if possible. In fact, if you think about it, since 1896, only once has a party lost the White House in 4 years. That was Carter in 76 to 80. Every other time, the party, usually the same president, sometimes a different president if there's obviously a death or impeachment or whatever. But the parties have held the White House for 8 years, for 8-year stretches. So guess what? Obama won. He's the incumbent. The country wasn't in great shape, but it wasn't in horrible shape. It wasn't the Great Depression, and he won by a narrower margin than he was elected with 4 years ago. What's more, the 4 incumbents who've lost are Taft in 1912, Hoover in 32, Carter and Ford in 76, and Carter in 80. 3 of them had primary challenges. Obviously, Taft from Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, which became a third-party challenge. 76, Reagan, a very tough challenge against Ford. Ford almost won anyway. And in 1980, Carter, a very tough challenge from Kennedy, with a third-party candidate then, John Anderson. And the other incumbent who lost was Hoover, 32, in the Great Depression. So it's not the single best thing President Obama did, probably, was avert a primary challenge. So far, it seems to be a perfect rule. If you avoid the Great Depression and if you avoid a primary challenge and you're an incumbent president, you will be reelected, as long as it's after 1896. So far, I think that qualifies as a political science rule. I should submit this to the APSR and get tenure somewhere. Honestly, putting Hillary Clinton in his cabinet, and I think he did it for other reasons as well, and he thought she'd be a good Secretary of State, and in some ways she has been an impressive Secretary of State, but putting Hillary Clinton in his cabinet, in retrospect, may have been the single best political decision Barack Obama made. If you imagine, and Bill and I remember Washington, I wasn't there, Bill wasn't, but from 76 to 80, what it was like for Carter to have Teddy Kennedy sitting in the Senate and the entire Kennedy team sort of spending half its time plotting the Kennedy run in 79 and 80 and half its time making Carter's life miserable in order to make the Kennedy run more plausible in 79, 80. The Clinton people would have been very tempted, let's put it that way, to do this if she had been in the Senate and estranged from the Obama administration. So actually people now take it for granted that, she's been Secretary of State for 4 years. It seems obvious that she was going to be Secretary of State. It was a big surprise when he announced it. It was against the recommendations of most of his personal aides and campaign staff, and he deserves credit. I think it was probably the right thing for the country too, but he deserves credit for doing that, and politically it was extremely smart. And he did other things over the course of the first 3 years of his presidency to avert primary challenges, being the first African-American president in a party that is the party with huge African-American support, made it harder, obviously, to challenge him, and so that was just a big advantage when you actually went to the ballot. So he won. But most incumbents win, including incumbents who don't leave a huge legacy or don't reshape history, and it doesn't tell you what's going to happen 4 years from now. Furthermore, and Bill mentioned this is just beginning to get noticed because in the initial flush of it was hard to get the data on election night or right early the morning afterwards. His vote seems to have dropped, and maybe dropped considerably from 2008. So for all the talk about the Obama coalition, and this is, it is impressive how they turned everyone out. They have a fantastic machine. At the end of the day, he got 70 million votes in 2008. What's he going to end up with, 61 or 62 million, something like that? This time, I think you have to give him another million or two for the storm, for Sandy, which seems to have knocked off a couple of million voters in New York and New Jersey from disproportionately from both parties. But even so, it's a somewhat striking drop. Turnout's gone up in the last 3 presidential elections. In this one, it will have gone down. And it isn't typically what happens if you're going to have a really affirmation and kind of consolidation of your mandate and of your agenda. So in that respect, that's somewhat encouraging, I think, for Republicans. So the way of putting it is they had the most sophisticated, by far, turnout machine ever. They're way ahead of the Republican Party in that. That's a problem in any one election, but it's in principle, that's the kind of thing you can catch up on. And if they're pulling and hauling and contacting and IDing and texting and using all this fantastic precision technology, and at the end of the day they drag 61 or 62 million Americans to the polls, it's not as impressive as it seems at first. They targeted them extremely well, they dragged them to the polls in the right states, and all that's to their credit, but as a sort of analytical matter, you've got to say, it doesn't feel, as Bill said, like 1936 or 1984, certainly. Mitt Romney had a good campaign, I think, and ended up being a better candidate than he started off, but he wasn't the perfect candidate in himself, and he wasn't the perfect candidate for this year, certainly. One-term former governor, just as a fairly thin political resume. He had won one election before running for president. Generally speaking, the Clintons and the Reagans and people who've run more often and won more often just tend to be better candidates. Being from Wall Street immediately after 2008 and a financial collapse that certainly can be partly blamed on Wall Street, and certainly the media and Democrats were happy to blame mostly on Wall Street, probably wasn't the ideal position to be in. He beat a weak primary field. It's not his fault that he ran against a weak primary field, but a lot of other Republican candidates I think he could have run. It might have been stronger candidates, the younger conservative reformers, some of the governors, even some of the not so young governors, Mitch Daniels, whatever. I just think would have been would have had a somewhat easier road, or more at least would have been more possible for them to come closer, at least, to President Obama than Mitt Romney did. I mean, if you think about it, especially the Wall Street, I think that really hurt more than, I'd say, if I can generalize, in our circles, in upper middle class, academic, whatever, well-educated circles, I think the attack on Romney as a kind of Wall Street, tycoon probably sounded a little tinny and a little kind of old-fashioned, quasi-Marxist, demagogic, Bain Capital and all that. But it actually, I think, probably was quite effective. If you look at some of the numbers, the voters who were available to Republicans who didn't turn out this time leaving aside the disaster with Latinos, which has its own explanation, were white working class voters who didn't actually come out to vote for Barack Obama. They just didn't vote. That's why turnout is down. Sean Trend has an interesting piece. In Ohio, turnout's mildly up in upper middle class Republican areas, the suburbs of Columbus and Hamilton County and Cincinnati. Turnout's okay, mildly up, actually up among African Americans, sort of okay in liberal areas, good enough, obviously, for President Obama. They got everyone to the polls they could. The place where turnout goes down is poor rural white areas, both working class and sort of exurban, almost, as I say, rural evangelicals. They don't come out, and I don't think that's because Romney's a Mormon. I think it's because they're put off enough by the Bain Capital side of the Romney biography, and to be fair, by the economic agenda of the Republican Party, probably, which is a slightly bigger problem, that they decide they'll just sit this one out. In any case, the Romney being not a great nominee is not a systemic or endemic problem. There are quite a good number of pretty attractive Republican nominees, arguably, for 2016, so that's not a fundamental thing to be depressed about, I would say. There were some I do think Republicans, especially in the Senate, just had an amazing number of bad candidates this year. Now, maybe that's a systemic problem if the party's throwing up a lot of bad candidates. On the other hand, some of it was just fluky. I mean, a couple of the Tea Party types blew themselves up in totally winnable seats in Indiana and Missouri. But the establishment candidates were no better. The establishment cheerfully went around nominating a sort of old hack congressman who'd been around forever to run against Democratic incumbents or for open seats, against Democrats who were reasonably attractive candidates in many cases. We had the bizarre situation that in a year in which Washington's unpopular and everyone wanted to run against Washington, certainly on the Republican side, in state after state, the Republican nominee had been in Washington longer than the Democratic nominee, or had been in politics longer than the Democratic nominee. So in Virginia, where I live, if you want to cast a sort of protest vote, Georgia Allen is not the perfect, vehicle for that against Tim Kaine. And Berg and Rehberg and North Dakota and Montana were long-serving, had been in Washington longer than the incumbents they were running against in the case of Montana. Or Connie Mack Jr. has been in Washington for quite a long time in Florida. There was just one case after another where the Republican nominee was not a good spokesman for change or reform or a fresh face or something of that sort. So there was some bad luck in that respect, I would say. Each bad candidate is bad in his own way, And so you can't so hard to generalize about them all, but I do think, especially on the Senate level, they were just bad candidates. And final point, if you want to cheer yourself, so that that presumably needn't replicate itself 2 or 4 or 6 years from now. And final point, if you want to cheer yourself up, these things do reverse. Everyone has deep analyses every 2 and 4 years, and we're guilty of this to some degree too. And then, why some trend is now embedded. It's going to be the work. I love these pieces in the paper yesterday. It's going to be the work of generations for the Republican Party to fix A, B, or C. It's going to be the work of generations for the Democrats to fix themselves after losing 3 blowout elections in a row in 80, 84, and 88. And it was the work of actually about 2 years, and Bill Clinton did it. And then they promptly won, and they've won 4 of 6 presidential elections since losing 3 big elections in the 80s. These things just reverse more quickly than people expect, and unanticipated events happen. In that case, the end of the Cold War, which I think opened up huge opportunities for the Democrats and Clinton. And the two together fundamentally changed the character of presidential politics in this country. Think about that. Republicans won 5 of 6 elections from 68 through 88. The Democrats have won the popular vote in the 5 of 6 elections from 92 on. Obviously, only won 4 of them. And incidentally, to transition now from the reassuring to the panicking. One of my favorite quotes, as I've used a couple of times in this election cycle, is from the prophet Aladdin, as I like to call him, when, in the Disney movie, when he says, Abu, this is no time to panic, start panicking. That little of that wouldn't hurt the Republicans. So on the panic side now, as opposed to the calm down side, I'd say that my first point would just be the one I mentioned. If you lose 4 of 6 elections and 5 of 6 in the popular vote, if the 4 that you lose are pretty handy losses, pretty convincing losses, 92, 96, 08, and then 2 days ago, and the 2 you win are Florida by 537 votes in 2000 and Ohio by 125,000 votes, I think it was, in 2004, you've got a problem. You're losing easily, and you're winning by the skin of your teeth. And those are all the post-Cold War presidential elections. So it would be a fair statement that the Republican Party has not proven it can really run a very compelling presidential campaign post-Cold War. And since the Cold War ended 20 years ago, that's not a great thing for the Republican Party. Furthermore, they have proven they can run good off-year campaigns, especially when a new Democrat is president and is trying to pursue a liberal agenda. In 94 and 2010 were by far the biggest Republican years, obviously, of the last quarter century since Reagan. And the good news is that voters were available for an anti-big government message in those 2 years. The bad news is, at the end of the day, presidential elections, not congressional elections, more than congressional elections, shape American politics. The other bad news is the Republican Party was incapable of following up on either of those victories. So in 94, the question became, could you transform that into a governing conservatism from a kind of protest against Clinton and Hillary care in 94? And the answer was no. Clinton won easily in 96 by tacking to the center. After 2010, the question was, could the Tea Party energy be channeled into producing a strong candidate and then a presidential victory in 2012? Obama didn't really tack to the center, and nonetheless, he didn't get the votes Clinton got in 96, but nonetheless, he was able to win as well in 2012. So I think for me, 94 and 2010 are worrisome because it means you have a powerful protest party, but conceivably not a powerful governing party at the national level. At the state level, I'll footnote back into the cheer up or calm down, whatever that first section was called. Depends how extreme you want to be. Maybe calm down is better than cheer up, I think. But in the calm down category, I would say there are an awful lot of Republican governors in the country who seem to be doing very well in terms of policy and politics. And, a party that was just on the ropes and collapsing and had nothing to say wouldn't have Mitch Daniels and Chris Christie and Scott Walker and others, Bobby Jindal, governing effectively, I would say, from some objective point of view, conservatively, and politically being quite popular in their own states, and in many cases already having gotten reelected. We'll see what happens with some of the others, Christie in 2013, McDonnell in Virginia too. A lot of these are states, obviously, that Obama carried in 2008 and again in 2010. So I think the governors is sort of a good news story. On the other hand, what it takes to be a successful governor isn't what it takes to run nationally and to win nationally and to govern nationally. The Republican Party, I guess, had successful governors throughout the 32 to 68, the height of the New Deal period. It didn't really prove the Republican Party was really a competitive party in shaping the national agenda or the nation's history. It just proved that there were good Republican parties and some competent Republican governors at the local and state level. So that's, it's kind of on the one hand, one is reassured to look around and see these Republican governors. On the other hand, one probably shouldn't reassure oneself too much. The flip side of President Obama losing votes from 2008 to 2012, excuse me, is that Republicans at the presidential level, now the data again for 2012 is a little bit incomplete and a little bit distorted by the storm, but Bush got about 62 million votes in 2004. McCain got about 60 million votes in 2008, and it looks like Romney's going to end up with, 59 million votes or so, maybe 60 in 2012. In other words, the actual number, in an increasing electorate, the actual number of Republican voters at the presidential level has been going slightly down. That is not a good sign, obviously, and probably the single most worrisome. It's the flip side, of course, of the fact that Republicans have lost the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 elections. That's a very worrisome sign. Latino voters are particularly have been one reason for that decline. I suspect almost all that decline actually would be going from 44% of the Latino vote to 31% and then 27%. That's a pretty disastrous place for a political party to be with one of the largest growing segments of the electorate. But as has been pointed out, in this election, Romney also lost a lot of downscale white voters that Bush was able to get and that he might have been expected to get, given unhappiness with the economy and a lack of great empathy, let's say, with President Obama. The more fundamentally troubling, but the Hispanics, I think I myself am a liberal on immigration reform, so I'll be happy if the Republicans end up helping pass something and, in a sense, removing what I think has been a self-inflicted, or undoing a self-inflicted injury. It'll still take a few years probably to undo fully on the Latino side. For me, by far the more worrisome number is the youth vote, since by definition you're probably not going to be a future governing party if you're losing young voters 2-1, which was the case in 2008, and about 3-2 this time. So the good news is some of them came to their senses, but the bad news is some of you came to your senses. But the bad news is not enough of them, and it's going to take a long time at that rate to get to 50-50, let alone an actual majority of young voters. So that is, I think, fundamentally worrisome. One, just is, in a way, all the same data, just looked at different ways. But another thing, if you want to be worried, is think of it this way. McCain ran in 2008 at the height of the financial crisis, unpopular wars, an unpopular Bush presidency, which people were tired of, controversial vice presidential pick with Sarah Palin, barely, not even a real campaign or a real campaign organization by the time September and October rolled around, totally dysfunctional internal fighting. He himself, though a very admirable man, was not at all a natural presidential candidate. None of the discipline that Romney has, none of the preparation, none of the organization, about a third to a half of the money that Mitt Romney had. McCain was outspent about 2-1. Romney was basically, if you put in the outside groups, even. And at the end of the day, so Romney should have been, and Obama's president, and we have a very slow economy, and things aren't great in the country, and people think the country's on the wrong track. by about 60-40, which is usually a pretty good indicator of trouble for the incumbent. So all these things are going Republicans' way in 2012 and 2010. Romney gets about this, not more votes than McCain got. Romney flips 2 states that McCain lost, Indiana and North Carolina, which McCain lost by less than a percentage point each. All this effort, $900 million, a very competent professional campaign, a guy who was planning to be president for 6 years, a good VP pick, a moderate, a guy who tacked to the center to try to be reassuring to women. He had all these binders of women and everything. McCain didn't have those binders of women. And you flip Indiana and North Carolina, 2 states that were kind of fluky that that Obama won in the first place, and that's it. I mean, that is worrisome, I would say. Now, maybe, I'm open to the notion that a Christie or a Daniels or Jeb Bush or many other people, Ryan himself, could have run much better campaigns and appealed to a lot of voters that Romney didn't. But at the end of the day, Romney seems to have run a pretty good campaign. He certainly had a very good debate where he fixed some of the, presumably fixed some of the perceptions that the Obama people had hammered home. As I say, a pretty good environment out there by normal political science standards to run against an incumbent. To only be able to get back Indiana and North Carolina is pretty worrisome. Excuse me. And you could say, well, it still was pretty close in the 3 big swing states, and it was pretty close. Florida was really close. I assume Obama's won it or will win it, but by less than a point. And Virginia by about 2 points, Ohio by about 2 points, so that's a pretty thin margin. But it's worth also remembering that even if Romney had won all those 3, he would not have won the presidency. He would have been at 266 in the Electoral College. And the next state, I think, is Colorado, right, with about more than a 5-point margin. That is 4. Okay, so, there's no state, he would have had to improve 4 points in the next swing state to win the presidency by, 1 or 2 electoral votes. So one shouldn't minimize the degree to the extent of Obama's victory. It's, on the one hand, kind of narrow from a popular vote point of view, but it's a pretty decisive victory, and certainly much more decisive than Bush and than any victory Republicans won since '88. Final point in this, I don't know, this is maybe back more in the calm down. On the reversal side of things, one way in which these reversals happen, and this just happens to be a pattern I noticed, is parties seem to not, when they're running against an incumbent, this is generalizing from 5 cases, so it's like, but on the other hand, why not? That's what political scientists do all the time, false generalizations and stated with great certainty. When we're running against incumbents, the parties seem to nominate experienced candidates. I think there might be in the back of primary voters' minds a certain sense that, well, we need to put up someone with stature because you're running against the President of the United States. So the Democrats in '84 nominate the former Vice President, Walter Mondale, and then in '88, running against the incumbent Vice President, George H.W. Bush, they nominate Dukakis, an experienced, well-respected, competent, technocratic governor. Similarly, in this year, running against President Obama, well, in '04, the Democrats nominate John Kerry, one of their most experienced senators, foreign policy experience, against Bush. '96 against Clinton, Republicans nominate Dole, and then this year, Republicans nominate Mitt Romney. That doesn't work. The incumbent, the electorate couldn't care less about all these years of Senate experience or business experience or other kinds of experience, gubernatorial experience. They re-elect the incumbent. And then typically, it seems, the party 4 years later says, okay, enough with all these older, experienced guys. Now we're going to nominate someone younger, newer, and fresher. And if you think about it, in '92, the Democrats, having done Mondale and Dukakis, turned to Clinton, who is not the kind of Mario Cuomo generation of let's nominate someone who's been a leader of the party a long time, but someone who's somewhat experienced, but still young, obviously. Clinton Gore, a very young ticket, and a different kind of Democratic ticket in '92. And similarly, of course, the biggest example of this would be '04 to '08, where the Democrats don't follow up the nomination of John Kerry with Hillary Clinton. They follow up the nomination of John Kerry by skipping a generation and going to an African American and nominating a 4-year senator, Barack Obama. So, and that seems to work better, incidentally. Maybe it's because those are open seats, and so the experience thing seems less important, whatever. And it turns out the Clintons and the Obamas win, and the Dukakises and the Kerrys lose. On that analogy, and I think it's not a ridiculous analogy, the Romney is in a certain way, not just because he's from Massachusetts, but is sort of a Dukakis-Kerry analog, and I really don't say that in any, I mean, just I'm not making a judgment about whether that's good or bad, but I think in terms of stature, experience, having been around a while, not being a great natural candidate, but being respected by the elites of the party. And the question for the Republicans is, who's the Clinton-Obama analog for next time? And I think that would obviously be more of a Ryan, Rubio, Christie, whatever type. Could also be a Rand Paul type. That's a little worrisome, but that's another story. So that, I don't know, I think I think, let me put it this way. I spent the last 2 years saying in speeches that I couldn't, the Republican Party is a ridiculous party in many ways, and it's particularly hierarchical and deferential. It always nominates the second place finisher from the time before. Bush beats Reagan in Ford beats Reagan in 76, so Reagan gets the nomination in 80. Reagan beats Bush in 80, so Bush gets the nomination in 88. Bush beats Dole in 88, so Dole gets the nomination in 96. Then the party really does something wild and crazy and nominates George W. Bush in 2000, the son of a former president, and then he puts Dick Cheney on the ticket to reassure everyone that it's still a very boring and old party. Then Bush beats McCain in 2000, and McCain gets the nomination in 08. And I spent really most of the last 4 years falsely saying, we can't go through this again. It's ridiculous. I mean, this is like such an old kind of, been there, done that sort of scenario. And it's a new world, and the technology's new, and Obama beating Clinton shows that there's a real appetite and wish for new faces and for younger people, and the establishments are finally going to start losing these fights, and then the Tea Party happens in 2009 and 2010, and I figure, finally we're going to break this ridiculous pattern of nominating the runner-up from the time before. And of course, they promptly nominate Romney in 2012. I do really think this time in 2016, I'll make this prediction early in the 2016 cycle, that Republicans will not nominate Rick Santorum next time. And finally we'll break this pattern, which is, they've been fine individuals, some of these men who were nominated. They probably weren't the best candidates in every case. And that I think, maybe they'll do the equivalent of the, if I can turn this off, the Obama, they'll do the equivalent of the Clinton or Obama type nomination. Final point, I'm sort of more above the kind of, little questions about party politics. I want to say a word about ideas and a word about reality. Ideas matter, as we know. Reality matters too. In terms of ideas, I think the biggest problem that a president faces, and I don't say this, I do say this in a somewhat polemical way, but I think it's analytically true, is it's not clear that he has any ideas that can solve the problems that we face domestically or abroad. If you believe if he solves them, he'll be a successful president, and he'll be FDR, and we'll have 30 years of liberalism, and we'll all be happy, and that'll be great. But I'm just very unconvinced that either in domestic policy or in foreign policy, his basic view of the world is going to end up being vindicated if those policies are put into effect, or to the degree that they're put into effect. Bill mentioned California. The California Republican Party, which I agree has been in terrible shape since the Pete Wilson 94 campaign. California's been run by liberals entirely. But the trouble is California is also in terrible shape. And I do think that we could have a bad situation where conceivably if the Republican Party is foolish, the Democrats will run the country for the next 10 to 20 years, but then we'll end up in the same fiscal situation as California, which will not be a good thing. And California, incidentally, on Tuesday, is now in a classic I'd say welfare state death spiral, where they now have decided to strengthen the public employee unions, increase taxes by a few percentage points more, and really end up in, I think, a terrible, terrible, untenable situation. Maybe this is a much longer discussion, but I just don't, we'll see. Maybe Obama will go to the center, maybe he'll be like Clinton, maybe he'll be serious about dealing with debt and deficit. You can't run $1 trillion deficits forever. I do think foreign policy, we have huge problems abroad. I hope they don't, get too much worse. I hope they don't get worse at all. And I hope we dodge bullets, so to speak, for the next 4 years. And I hope he moves to the center and succeeds in certain things. But I'm very dubious that that'll be the case. And look, reality does matter in that respect. I just hope we don't pay too much of a price for this past election. And I hope but I think politically it does mean there's a huge opportunity coming, I suspect, for conservatives and Republicans. Just as at the state level, the bankruptcy of liberal policies has provided a big opportunity for Republicans. I think the same will happen. It could have happened this year. It wasn't quite evident enough. It was confused by Bush's presiding over the 08 meltdown, I think, which Obama and especially Clinton effectively used to sort of deflect responsibility from his failures, and I don't blame them for doing it. It was a reasonable thing to do. But I think we didn't get a kind of clean ability, and Romney being from Wall Street, there wasn't a clean chance for conservatives to say, wait a second, here's the alternative to failed big government, liberal welfare state policies. But, final point, that does put a big burden on conservatives, which is to come up with successful, non-liberal, modern economic and policies and fiscal policies and foreign policies. I think the outlines of them are in many cases there, but I would say that the National Republican Party hasn't done a very good job, and maybe some of us haven't done a very good job of articulating those policies and working them out. I'd say, take the '08 financial crisis, for example. There is no really compelling, or at least, well, there are compelling, but there's no publicly available and sort of agreed upon narrative of that crisis from a conservative point of view, which explains what happened, the degree to which various liberal big government policies are, as I believe they are, culpable for that crisis, but also the degree to which various conservative policies may have been mistaken. And we shouldn't have let the big banks do what they did. And here's why conservatives in opposing Dodd-Frank actually are would be willing to break up the big banks instead of, guarantee their endless existence as too big to fail and all that. There have been sporadic attempts, I would say, in various magazines and journals and by individual politicians to articulate a sort of post-2008 financial set of policies with respect to financial institutions. The same is probably true in terms of tax reform. The same is true to some degree on entitlement reform. There, I think Ryan is way ahead of where Republicans are in other areas. But it's a huge challenge, obviously, for conservatives in the world we live in to really explain the policies that would work. I think that's the key task. I actually think if conservatives can do that over the next 3-4 years, I actually think the prospects are quite good, because I honestly don't believe liberal policies will work. If liberal policies work very well, then we'll all have to reconsider our views about the world, and I suppose become liberals. But I don't, and I'll report back in 2 or 4 years if that happens. But I don't expect to. I expect to come back in 2 or 4 years, and first come back in 2014 and have, I suppose, a decent Republican off-year election. It's always hard to tell what's going to happen there. But really, the big question for me on the Republican and conservative side is, do young leaders emerge and are policies articulated at the state level, at the congressional level, by candidates beginning to run for office that are comparable in either seriousness intellectually to what Clinton was able to do between '88 and '92 on the Democratic side, and or that can sort of capture the spirit of lots of voters in the way that Obama was able to do actually in '07, '08. Those are different from each other and in some tension with one another. Obama was able to capture everyone's spirit by going along with a pretty left-wing Democratic Party in '07, '08, I would argue. He beat Clinton because he voted against the war, et cetera. Clinton did the opposite in a sense from '88 to '92. You can do one or the other. You can't do neither. You can't have neither a charismatic younger politician who seems to somehow embody the spirit of the times and the spirit of the future, nor a rethinking of failed policies of the past. I think in some ways that's what we had, as what Republicans had in 2012, and lost a pretty decisive defeat, for which we will unfortunately, I think, pay some price, the country, for a little while. But it's a strong country, and there's a lot of, what did Adam Smith say? There's a lot of ruin in a great nation. So we will test that proposition over the next 4 years. Thank you.
So you're probably wondering, who is this guy? We've been coming here for 10 or however many years it is, and you hear the two bills, and then all of a sudden a mic stands up, and all I can say is I'm not quite sure myself. They've been talking about what actually happened in this election, and I think what I've been asked to do is to talk about what didn't happen. Namely, we did not have much, if any, discussion of a perennial issue in American politics, which is the judiciary and the selection of judges. It was like the last several presidential elections. In fact, I think going back at least to Reagan's time, it's been a major topic of discussion, especially Republican candidates bringing up the subject, and it was pretty much radio silence this time. And so I'm just going to offer a couple of thoughts about why that might be true, and maybe a little bit about the significance of it. I have three reasons why I think it might be true. And the first is that the Obama administration didn't actually pay very much attention to judge picking and to the judiciary over the last 4 years. Liberal legal types have been very disappointed in the administration. They were extremely slow to nominate judges. They were completely reluctant to expend any political capital in getting them nominated, to the point that if a single Republican senator would refuse to go along with unanimous consent, they just said, okay, we won't bother, and they didn't take their nominees to the floor, which is even nominees who we know would be elected, would be confirmed by overwhelming majorities because there wasn't any serious opposition. They would just let them languish and not bring them to the floor. In marked contrast to the Republican leadership during the last administration, do you remember they kept bringing Miguel Estrada to the floor over and over? If they're going to defeat him, make them vote against him. And they put some real effort behind it. We saw nothing of the sort. We also saw that the choice of nominees for the courts were almost without exception on the non-controversial side. The only serious exception would be the nomination of Goodwin Liu to the Ninth Circuit, later withdrawn. He's now a justice on the California Supreme Court. But he was the only nominee who had a real ideological profile. By and large, the rest, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with them, and many of them are actually, I mean, there are a number of the nominees I think will be distinguished judges, but they were of a different ilk. They were kind of a snore, politically speaking, and that's really true of the two Supreme Court justice nominees as well. And again, this is nothing against them. They may be very great justices, but they were chosen to minimize opposition and to get through as easily as possible. Sonia Sotomayor was a lower court judge for 19 some odd years, and the Republicans could barely find any opinions that she had written to raise a complaint about. I was on the court for maybe 7 years, and I bet they could have found, a dozen of mine that would be worth a headline or two. And then there's Elena Kagan, who had served less than a year as Solicitor General, most famous for being dean of the Harvard Law School, where she gets standing ovations from the students who are members of the Federalist Society because they thought she was so fair to conservative students, and hired more conservative faculty to Harvard Law School than any dean in recent history. And so, Elena Kagan was not the sort of person who was going to excite much opposition. And so I think the first reason why the judiciary was not much of an issue is that the first term of the Obama administration did not excite much attention. But the second reason, I think, is that it's usually Republicans who talk about judges during the election time, and the main electoral point of this, I don't mean to say that this is the important point jurisprudentially or for the nation, but in terms of electoral politics, the main point of talking about judges is that that's what the Republicans do for the social right, is that they nominate a few judges who will be thought to be opposed to abortion or same-sex marriage or whatever, whether they actually vote that way when they get on the bench or not. And it seems to me that it's quite clear that in this election, the Republican nominees chose a strategy that they were going to talk about the social issues as little as possible, that they wanted to make this a referendum on the economic problem, and they wanted this to be an election in which the very serious differences of opinion on those more emotional issues would be put aside. They're kind of a luxury for a time when our house is in order, and not the thing to be talking about when we're facing serious economic problems and fiscal catastrophe. And so judges are not, so they chose not to bring them up. The occasional time when they do bring them up, it becomes, again, it reminds people of the social issues. The only time I think, you all may pay more attention to the politics in the campaign than I do, but the only time I remember this issue coming up at a very high level was in the vice presidential debate, where the vice president made the, manifestly incorrect statement that if Roe versus Wade is reversed, that would mean that abortion is outlawed in the United States, when of course all it would mean is that the issue is returned to the states. And I don't know, but my guess is very little outlawing would actually go on in the wake of that. And Congressman Ryan didn't even call him on it. He was so, I think the strategy must have been, do not engage on that, even when the vice president says something that's sort of manifestly foolish. So they stay away from it. But I think the big reason, the most overwhelming reason why the judiciary was not much in the election was the health care decision from last spring, which sort of reshuffled the deck and caused everybody to be discontented because outside of, you have to say, so what are the Republicans going to say exactly? Outside of highly ideologized circles in America, most people have a fairly simple idea of what they want from judges. They want the judges to, you've heard this before, enforce the law, not make the law. Now, I don't have any polling data to support that, but we know it's true because nominees across the ideological spectrum, when put in front of the Klieg lights and asked, what's your philosophy of judging, will say, my philosophy of judging is to follow the law, not to make the law. Right? But it is basically more of a Republican judge thing to do that than it is for the Democrats. And so the case, the health care case presented two problems. First of all, the theory under which Republican-leaning lawyers and states went was not exactly a follow-the-law theory. It was a theory that whatever its merits might be was so creative, right, that 6 or 9 months before it, you could scarcely find an academic or an experienced appellate lawyer who thought that the theory had very much of a chance. It's a theory that was so creative that if you look at the lower court decisions, every one of the cases that was decided by a conservative Republican jurist in the highest ranks of stature. I mean, that's a bit intuitive, but I think most people, at least in my business, knows who those people are. Every one of those judges rejected the challenge, right? And yet, amazingly, by the time the decision is about to come down, huge numbers of people, and especially in the activist crowd, had persuaded themselves that they had a victory on their hands, and the Chief Justice Roberts snatched it away from them, right? And it made so what is the brand? Is it we just follow the law, we don't make the law? I think the Republican-leaning lawyers who did this traded in that brand, which had actually served them very well in the past, for the opportunity of maybe striking down this piece of legislation that they regard as so misguided. But it leaves them with, what is the judicial philosophy we're talking about here? It is not judicial restraint anymore. Right? That's not quite what we have. And then the second thing is the outcome is so confusing. I think I understand it. If we had 25 minutes to talk about it, I bet I could explain it, but you cannot explain it in less than, many full paragraphs. It's too complicated. It's like a Rube Goldberg thing, and at the end, maybe it's right. I mean, I'm not saying it's completely implausible. I'm saying, though, that it doesn't look like just following the law. It looks extremely messed up. And then, of course, all of the histrionics that go along with it, with apparently 2 of the Republican-nominated judges or justices telling a reporter secrets about Chief Justice Roberts, changing his mind. I think that's unprecedented for that kind of internal backbiting to take place. The whole thing just ends up looking not good, right? It just doesn't look good anymore. And so usually when the Republican nominee is asked, what kind of justice are you going to name, they will proudly say, as McCain did 4 years ago, that they'll name the last 2 Republican nominees, and they can know that that's going to be pretty popular because they've been pretty good nominees. So when McCain, it was practically the only thing George W. Bush did that still had high approval was his choices for the Supreme Court. Well, how proudly was Romney going to say, I'd name, somebody like John Roberts, right? Because at this point, it's like conservatives didn't like him anymore because he snatched victory that they thought was coming, and yet he didn't really win any friends elsewhere. So it really made it difficult for Republican nominees to be able to identify, in simple, understandable, and realistic terms what kind of judges they were going to name. And so I think the healthcare decision is the third and probably biggest reason why it wasn't part of the dialogue. What will be interesting now is to see how President Obama behaves in this area over the coming 4 years, because most, I think, Democratic lawyers have been surprised and disappointed by the way he behaved the first 4 years, and there didn't seem to be any really strong tactical reason behind it. I think it's very likely that he's not going to follow that path, and that we'll see much more aggressive, much more controversial figures being put forward, which means that the judiciary will again return to public notice in the next several sets of elections, or so I would suppose. Thank you.
Now questions. Our speakers are all 3 very gifted in what I would call partisan objectivity. But if you want to ask a partisan question, feel free.
We use the standing mics, if that's all right, so people can come and stand up in the aisle. You don't mind? Voice to be captured across the I think Ryan was such strict instructions on the page. Anything was
Yes, that's better.
This is like the Kennedy School, Rory. Sir, what's your name?
Robert Chu.
Thank you.
I don't want to sound cynical, but I was wondering if any of you have thoughts as to why the Republican billionaires couldn't buy this election.
Yeah, I do. Money is overrated, actually. A lot of Republican billionaires, the money ended up being about even, obviously, in total, and the unions are actually much more effective than billionaires writing checks, because the unions have real people who do a lot of hard work, and they're very well organized. I give them credit for that. The Republicans thought money could replace that kind of organization, and you can't build it as quickly. I think that's one question, just as a tactical matter, the Republican Party is going to have to confront. The Democrats do have a big advantage, I think, with an ongoing union structure, including public employee unions, which that Republicans just weren't successful in replicating. They have an excessive view that super PACs could, of what they could do. There are a lot of unhappy Republican billionaires floating around now. I mean, it really is amazing, and this is too facile, but it is, if you think about it, I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent. It's very hard to make the case that if $0 had been spent, the presidential election would have turned out appreciably differently. You know, I still think Romney probably would have won Indiana and North Carolina. And so they spent $300 million at Crossroads. Karl Rove spent it, and they picked up 0 states. And honestly, did they turn any Senate races? They probably saved Heller in Nevada. So I'm going to stipulate that, and maybe one other. I think the Republicans would be 1 Senate seat worse without $300 million having been spent. So money is overrated. I don't think it was spent very well. You could have a technical, there's more issue discussion. Let me say a word about the issues, though, since Mike raised this in a way, and I'm curious to know what Bill thinks about this. The Romney campaign made an extremely self-conscious and strong tactical decision. I guess it was a strategic decision. It's the economy. I mean, they said it over and over. How many times do we hear Romney people quoted and Republicans all over the place quoted? Any day we're not talking about the economy is a day not well spent. We can't get diverted to any other issue. That governed their paid advertising. It governed the nominees' speeches. It governed the fact that Paul Ryan didn't address Joe Biden's misrepresentation in the debate. It was a reasonable strategic decision. I argued it with a lot of the Romney people. They had good data seemingly to back it up. I thought at the time, and I still think it was a mistake. I don't think you can win the presidency with a one-dimensional campaign. I think people want to know what you would do about foreign policy and about judicial appointments. I think Roberts made it very complicated, but actually I would make the opposite argument in a way. If Romney had stood up and said, you know what, I'm going to appoint justices like Sam Alito and John Roberts. They don't always agree with each other, but they both take the Constitution seriously. They're both extremely impressive. I think they are genuinely impressive. And basically, though, they're not going to take decisions out of the public's hands that you don't want taken out of your hands, like whether you should legalize same-sex marriage state by state as opposed to finding a constitutional right, to take one issue that I think will come up in the next 4 years, and depending on the composition of the court, wouldn't be out of the question that it would happen, or certainly strike down some of the pieces of legislation on that issue, the Defense of Marriage Act and the like. So I think they were so skittish about raising non-economic issues that, this gets to your question about the money, they spent $700 million telling the country, guess what? The economy's not great. Well, the country probably knew that without any money being spent, and they certainly knew it after the first $100 or $200 million. And believe me, I live, and you guys didn't see the ads if you live. I mean, you live in Northern Virginia. The 172nd ad of we have 23 million people who are underemployed, and 47 million people on food stamps. It just the marginal return for that ad cannot be very great. So but the billionaires like those ads, because the billionaires are socially liberal. They're made very uncomfortable by the social issues. They're mixed on foreign policy, but they sort of believe, rightly or wrongly, that that's too controversial. It sounds like Bush. You want to go to war everywhere. So what are you going to do? You stay away from those issues. Final point, this is a broader answer, but I really am curious to know what Bill thinks about this, and I think it's interesting. The Obama campaign did not have that attitude. He defended his economic record, sort of. He blamed Bush a lot, which he's certainly entitled to do. But if you lived in Northern Virginia, the ad you saw the most, you saw the 47% ad. That was extremely effective, I think. But the topic you saw the most ads on, I think this was my impression, and I believe it's been confirmed by some study, was in fact war on women. All the stuff that we thought was so ridiculous. Really? The Republicans are going to take away contraception? I mean, what are you talking about? And, Republicans hate women. Those ads were on all the time, and the data suggests that those ads actually worked pretty well, I think. And certainly Obama ran up massive margins. They targeted single women, unmarried women, and they got huge numbers in that group. So I think there was a certain Republican stand down or unilateral disarmament on the social and cultural issues, which I think served them poorly, though it was understandable why that happened. The Obama people did not disarm on those issues. He is as extreme on the pro-abortion side as Romney isn't even extreme, but even as extreme as you can characterize, in my view, any of the Republicans really on the pro-life side, but no one ever made that case. And that is partly due to the influence of donors in the Republican Party. So I would actually the billionaires had a bad influence on Republican fortunes in this election. Republicans have become too much of a donor-driven party, and I don't say that out of some fastidiousness about money and politics and all that. I actually think it's led them to underestimate how toxic it is to be the candidate of Wall Street, how toxic it is to not release your tax returns and that sort of stuff. And it leads them to also shy away from sort of lower middle class, working class, cultural concerns an awful lot of voters.
Well, first of all, we've now answered the question of the kind of stimulus package and redistribution of income that the Republican Party can get behind, because that was the contribution of the billionaires to the common weal in 2012, but more less snidely. Within living memory, point number one, the Republicans did out-organize Democrats on the ground in 2004.
Right.
And they did it not by inventing something top-down, but by activating evangelical troops, particularly in Ohio, but elsewhere. So this is not mission impossible, necessarily. That's point number one. Point number two, some of the money spent in 2012 actually made a difference, because if you look at the surveys of where voters are asked, have you been touched in a particular way by the Republican campaign, by the Democratic campaign, the results were near parity. And almost category by category, Republicans believe in some forms of contact more than Democrats, and vice versa. But everybody expected that there would be a huge asymmetry in that area, and there really wasn't. So I think that money can buy you something. And the question is why what the money bought didn't have more of an effect. And here it seems to me that you need a grand theory of what it means to be running against an incumbent. And in my model, for what it's worth, it's a two-stage decision-making process, where stage number one is there a latent majority that is willing to consider the possibility of replacing the incumbent? If the answer to that question is no, as it was, say, in 1996, then there's no election, right? You go through the motions, but the president would be reelected. There's pretty compelling survey evidence that in 2012 there was a bare latent majority willing to consider replacing Barack Obama. That threshold having been cleared, the question then became, was Mitt Romney an acceptable alternative to the president? And various things that happened during the campaign turned a bare majority of the American people against the proposition that he would be an acceptable candidate. Not just things that Democrats did, but things that Republicans didn't do to counter what Democrats did. I understand, especially based on today's reporting, which is excellent, but everybody knew already that the Romney campaign was flat on its back financially after the Republican primaries. That's not news. Everybody expected that the big money Republican groups would move into the breach and provide some air cover for the campaign while it was refilling its coffers in the summer. And there was a quotation in the newspaper yesterday or perhaps today, to the effect that Republican campaign operatives kept on looking in the sky, waiting for the bombers to appear and the bombs to start falling, and they never did. And so to an extraordinary degree, the Democrats had the summer to themselves, and to an extent that I didn't believe at the time, made good use of it. So, the ground was poorly prepared for an affirmative answer to the question of whether Romney was an acceptable alternative to an endangered incumbent. And that, in my judgment, is why Romney lost. And I'm not saying that it was necessarily a winnable race, but it could have been, I think, much closer to a cliffhanger than it was if the Romney campaign had done some things that it failed to do, or if Republicans outside the campaign had done what they obviously should have been doing during those 3 crucial months.
I'd like to point out that there's actually a legal issue here, which Bill brings out, which is the way he put it was that the Romney campaign was flat on its back. What I think Bill meant by that is at the end of the primary season, they were not legally permitted to raise and spend
Correct.
any more money. That is the law of the land, and it goes under the disguise of reform, and it is an outrageous interference in free and fair elections. Because what it means is that whichever party it is that has primaries, in which there's a disagreement about who's going to be the nominee, is going to be at a structural legal disadvantage in the election. And there is no good reform, there's no good government reform explanation for why that should be so. It is based upon the misconception of Congress. Well, maybe they did it deliberately, but I think it's a misconception years ago that the general campaign doesn't begin until after the conventions and in September. That is not so anymore. The summer is key. So to the questioner, the big money guys did win. They won over the summer when they could overwhelm, and the big money guys don't happen to be Republicans, but the big money guys won over the summer, and then it evens out, and there's no particular reason to think that the big Republican money guys are going to win when it's even, right? But over the summer, it was the law of the United States that prevented the Romney campaign from being able to present its case to the people, and I think we ought to repeal that ASAP. I don't speak as a Republican or as a Democrat on this, because it's simply unfair that the party that has primary elections is put at a systematic disadvantage in the election, and a disadvantage as serious as Bill makes it out to be.
But can I just add two very short words? It's sort of interesting. As a technical matter, the summer they were flat on their back, but of course the outside groups could have come in. But here they did to some degree. But the outside groups, by their nature, tend to attack the incumbent rather than do the biographical spots about the nominee. That's sort of left for the campaign itself. But they spent, and 90% of the ads of most of the big Republican outside groups were negative. So again, they hammered home the fact that Obama's not a great president. Maybe they reduced his approval from 49 to 48 for a couple of months, but they didn't. And they could have done this, of course. It would have been a little unconventional, but they could have done biographical spots on Mitt Romney of the kind that then we learned about at the Republican convention and afterwards, about what a good guy he was and what he had done and why Bain Capital had actually created a bunch of jobs and why his church activities were admirable and all that. They didn't do that. So I think the way in which you do spend the money matters a lot. It is also ridiculous for the campaign not to be able to raise and spend money because it was sort of artificial, I think.
And it's ironic that the solution to this misguided reform is these outside groups, and most people think the outside groups are the illegitimate, thing that we ought to squelch. But it's only we're looking to them to rescue us from the bad consequences of the law, which is supposed to be a reform.
But on the voter contact point, I just would say that I think the approval in every poll, at the end, Obama's done a good job, the Obama campaign, and the economy got a little better. So his approval was really right around 50, but it was almost nowhere below 49 and almost nowhere above 51, I think, in any of the national polls. I believe in the exit poll, his approval is at 54%. What does that tell you? They turned out more people who approved of Barack Obama, and the Republicans didn't turn out the disapprovers. And I was a subject, we were at home, of voter contact from Republicans, since we're registered Republicans in Northern Virginia. And the Republican voter contact, I know they put out all these studies, and they're not, we've touched as many people as the Democrats, we have as many phone calls. It was way inferior to Obama's voter contact. Organic voter contact is much better than paid phone groups with automated robocalls, or even nice individuals who clearly are clueless reading a script to you, grad students, no offense, trying to make a little extra, trying to make a little extra money. Well, that's who it is, or unemployed people trying to make a little extra money reading a script. This is why unions are good, and this is why churches are good. They're actual people who actually believe in something, who actually know the people they're in contact with, or if they don't know them, have a lot of similarities with them. If you come from one church in Kentucky to Ohio to convince your fellow, your compatriots to be for Romney, or if you come from a union hall in Illinois to go to Ohio, you have more in common than some voice over the phone. So I really think the quality of the Obama voter contact, and of course the technological social media stuff as well, was really superior to the Republican voter contact.
Well, we got a lot of mileage out of, forgive me, a rather unpromising question. But let's see what you can do.
Oh, I hope I can get half as much mileage as the previous questioner. I'm rather confused about the tax-mageddon fiscal cliff issue. I need more help in understanding it from whatever the panel can do for me. I think we're going to hear about very little else over the next month, probably, or 2 months. I think it's quite interesting that a re-elected Barack Obama, I understand on Tuesday night, I think it was, of the four things he listed as things he hoped to, problems he hoped to successfully tackle in his next term. I think the first one was the deficit issue, and the second issue, closely related, was the tax code. So I think this audience could receive more help in understanding the whole tax-mageddon, fiscal cliff, whatever we might call it. Thank you.
Well, before I try briefly to cast about 40 watts of light on that question, let me just comment on why you find it necessary to ask it.
I'm an economic illiterate.
No. That's no. I think much better of you than that. We went through, I believe, 3 full presidential debates and a vice presidential debate, and not one of the moderators ever put that question to the candidates. This is amazing, right? You don't need a crystal ball to know that however the election comes out, that would be the first item of business for the president-elect. That was as inevitable as anything is in politics because of the structure of the issue. I think it's fair to say that very few, if any, Americans received much illumination on that issue from the presidential campaign. That's one of a dozen ways in which it was a deeply disappointing campaign, right? The people, it was treated as an elite issue. The people were not brought into it, but it's a question that touches everybody and affects everybody. So that's point number one. Now, with regard to the issue itself, there are lots of intricacies, but the bottom line is actually not very complicated. If the Congress of the United States cannot come to some kind of agreement by December 31st, then, roughly speaking, 2 things are going to happen. Number 1, taxes are going to go up a lot, and number 2, spending is going to go down significantly, right? Details to come, but I could go through them point by point, but that's what you need to know right now. And the reason that's important is that the economy is still very fragile, and there seems to be agreement across party lines that combination of actions would have a depressing effect on a still fragile economy. The Congressional Budget Office thinks that combination of actions would plunge the country back into a recession. It estimates that would knock a little bit more than 4 percentage points off economic growth. And if you knock 4 points off a 2% growth rate, you get a recession. So, and Democrats think that because they believe that spending cuts impair economic growth. Republicans think that because they believe that tax increases impair economic growth. So the 2 parties who agree on very little else agree that the concrete economic consequences of falling over the cliff and crashing at the bottom would be very negative for the economy at a time when the economy needs all the help it can get and certainly doesn't need more balls and chains around its legs as it staggers forward. So that's what's at issue. And the question that's now being debated is how the parties can get to yes, or get to enough of a yes to avert the cliff. And there are very few people who are in favor of simply postponing the day of reckoning, although I can't rule that out as a possible outcome of these negotiations. But there are a lot of people who believe that making some progress on the larger issues, creating some sort of framework for legislation that would then take place in the first 6 months of 2013, is about the best that the Congress can do, and that it would be a substantial achievement if it were able to do that. That's the lay of the land. And the question du jour in Washington is whether the dynamics set in motion by the 2012 election will have the consequence of giving all parties new incentives to reach some sort of agreement. And if the answer to that question is yes, then we will avert Taxmageddon. And Taxmageddon, by the way, is only one part of the story, which is why fiscal cliff is a better locution. If we don't get to yes, then I've described what most people think will happen, and it won't be pretty. One final point. There are a lot of people who are now speculating about steps that the president and the executive branch could take in the short term to mute the impact of these steps. For example, apparently the IRS has it in its power not to change the withholding tables immediately, so that people don't start immediately feeling a huge cut in take-home pay. There are other things that can be done to mute the impact of this, but overall, there's very little argument as to what the overall direction of that impact is going to be.
May I jump in here? I've been fascinated with budget issues for a long time. I used to be Assistant General Counsel of the Office of Management and Budget, and that always put a lot of people to sleep through most of my life, and suddenly people are talking about this, and it makes me feel very excited. What I think I'm not disagreeing with Bill, but what I think he underplays in all of this is that there's a short-term and then there's a long-term problem. The short-term problem, the fiscal cliff, is the fact that the Congress has already passed legislation that increases taxes and makes these particularly stupid cuts. I mean, it's not just that they're cuts, but they're particularly, actually, we know that they're stupid because the reason that they were done was that they adopted it's called sequestration. They adopted that deliberately as the scare tactic that would force them into a more sensible thing. Remember the super committee of summer before last, they were, and the sequestration was deliberately designed to be so damaging and so terrible that they would do something else instead. They didn't. So that's what we've got facing us. But that's the short-term problem. The thing is that you can actually solve the short-term problem very easily by agreeing not to increase taxes and not to cut spending. Everybody's for that, right? It's the long-term problem that's really the fiscal, I call it chasm rather than a cliff, just in order to give a different vocabulary for it. And just roughly on that, looking back since World War II, by and large, with very small variations, we have spent about 20% of GDP, and we have brought in as tax revenue about 18% of GDP. That's why we've had a growing federal debt all of this time. But the nice thing about that is that was okay as long as the gap between those numbers is less than the growth rate of the economy, then the debt still remains stable as a percentage of the economy, and things are really okay. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether tax rates are 90% as they were in the 50s, or down to 28% as they were briefly in the 80s, we still seem to get about 18% in revenue, right? And so this happened for a long time, but the recent economic catastrophe has changed things so that we are now looking at spending at somewhere between 23, 24% of GDP, and we're looking at tax revenues coming in at somewhere between 15 and 16% of GDP. So we've gone from 2%, which is less than the growth rate, to what you do the math, but an enormously 7 or 8% difference.
Not bad for a judge.
Which is, and that's why we're adding over $1 trillion to the debt each year, and that cannot go on for very much longer, because we do get to a tipping point where the interest rate on that is going to be so great that it's going to dwarf spending on education and the military and everything else. We have to do something about that. So solving the short-term tax-mageddon problem by putting it off is just going to make the long-term chasm much worse, and the long-term problem is much harder to solve than the short-term problem, and is much more important to ourselves and our children and our grandchildren than the short-term problem.
Well, I don't disagree with most of that, but in the name of a little bit of contention, let me make 2 points. First of all, I think it's unsound, as a poll star of public policy, to assume that the level of federal spending as a percent of gross domestic product that prevailed through most of the post-war period represents a reasonable benchmark for policy over the next generation. And the reason is very simple. We are an aging society. That has consequences. And so one of two things must be the case. Either we will, in a rough and ready way, sustain social provision, social insurance for an aging society. We could trim it some, and I'm in favor of that. But even if we do that, we're going to end up over the next 10 years with spending in the 21 to 22% range, and that would be a very good outcome. In the long run, all of the pressure is upward. If, on the other hand, we impose a 20% ceiling, well, then you get some version of Paul Ryan's budget. And I doubt very much that the American people, if that approach to these problems were actually put on the table as the centerpiece of debate, I do not think it would be ratified, for a very simple reason. It implies dramatic changes in systems of social provision for which the American people have not been prepared by either political party. Now, I'm not ruling out the possibility that if the issue is fairly joined and people understand that the issue is either a higher level of taxation or dramatic reductions in spending for programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, I'm not sure that they might side with the Ryan approach, but there has been no honest public discussion of that issue. Both sides have chosen to evade one piece or another of the argument, because the Obama administration does not want to be on record as saying that it's in favor of a very significant tax increase, which is why you get this nonsense about ending the Bush tax cuts for the upper 2%, which would generate about $800 billion over the next 10 years in the face of an $8 trillion deficit over the next 10 years. It just doesn't do the job, period, full stop. And for a fleeting moment, I thought there might be an honest debate on this subject from the Republican side after Paul Ryan's selection as vice president. But when he started to talk injudiciously, that is to say honestly, about that issue, he was silenced by the Romney campaign because they didn't want that debate either. And so we've never had an honest debate about what the real choices are.
This is so true, but note how stark these numbers are.
Yeah.
Because since World War II, about 18%. Bill is telling us it has to be not just 19, not just 20, but it has to be 21, 22. That is a huge increase in the amount of national wealth which is being consumed by the federal government. And it is going to require massive tax increases, not just on the rich, but on everybody. I personally believe the only way we could do that model, I'd rather get it down to 2021 rather than 21, 22, and I think that is doable. But who knows? But the only way we can increase that much revenue is to have a VAT, a value-added tax, as European countries do. People don't want that, but I think it's the only solution, because increasing marginal tax rates on income is it's a losing game. Every increase is marginally less, brings in marginally less money than the one before.
But that's not the only way to think about the problem. We have a tax system now that is honeycombed with preferences, credits, deductions, etc. And we could have rates no higher than, and in fact lower than, the current rates if we were willing to entertain a serious conversation about tax reform. And I thought that Romney made a constructive suggestion when he talked about capping the total of tax, deductions or tax expenditures available. And that was actually not only a sensible suggestion, but it was also a progressive suggestion, because it would put most of the burden on the people in Potomac, Maryland, who are now buying $3 million mansions and writing off all of their interest expenses. Why should the federal government be in the business of subsidizing $3 million mansions in Potomac, Maryland? So there are lots of things to talk about here, but we have to have an honest discussion about them, and that has not happened.
Not only was it a constructive suggestion, it was made by a Harvard professor, actually, Marty Feldstein, in the pages of the Weekly Standard, I think. And Romney picked it up, and it was actually I think it ultimately would be more doable than specifying which deductions you're going to remove, just cap the total amount. It's actually quite progressive, quite redistributionist, because obviously if you cap at 50,000 or whatever, it caps the amount of deductions the wealthy can take, not those that the middle class can take. The only word I would mention in this whole debate is growth. Actually, you can work your way out of this big problem we have. It does require probably more tax revenues. It certainly requires controlling spending, which requires controlling entitlements, which requires controlling health care. That's what it comes down to. It's Medicare and to some degree Medicaid reform. I do think, so on that side, incidentally, the good news of this election, Paul Ryan touched that third rail. Mitt Romney picked Paul Ryan, and Medicare was not a huge issue. They didn't advertise much on it. The Obama campaign, the exit polls suggest it was kind of a wash. The counterattack on it wasn't bad. I thought one of the few issues where Romney and Ryan really struck back pretty effectively. I thought after he was picked in August, Obama. It was complicated because Obamacare is so unpopular that the whole health care debate became sort of, is Ryan's Medicare proposal. It was less unpopular than perhaps President Obama's Obamacare legislation, and so in a way it was a good time for Republicans to raise Medicare, since the healthcare world was less friendly to the Democrats than the healthcare issue or set of issues was less friendly to the Democrats than it normally has been. But I think we actually crossed something of a bridge. So to cheer people up a little bit, I would say that. I think Medicare reform is now on the table, and we had a presidential campaign in which Romney didn't win, but he didn't get destroyed because he picked Ryan or because Romney and Ryan themselves were on record for pretty fundamental Medicare reform. They backed off some, I agree, from what the Ryan budget is to the Romney plan, but it was still addressed in a fairly serious way. But you can get tax revenues up some, you can get spending down, I would hope a fair amount. Defense, incidentally, is a smaller percentage of the federal spending. It's about 4%, so you're not going to get much savings out of that, and I would argue it would be unwise. But whether it's unwise or not, you're just not going to get enough money out of that. It is Medicare and health care. But growth really helps. And Ryan, this is, I think, a mistake politically, but also intellectually that the Romney campaign made. They didn't emphasize the growth side of the conservative economic agenda. You can say it's not right, but conservatives think it's right, that you can get a lot more economic growth with good tax policies and with reasonable entitlement reform, and incidentally with big regulatory changes and the like, energy policy. No, right, you really could imagine, and in a 4 or 5% growth scenario, let's say 4%, 3.5%, you do get, this problem becomes much more manageable than a 1.5 or 2% growth economy. That's one reason why we've had these $1 trillion deficits. We're not growing fast enough. So that, I think, was both a little bit of a political mistake. Maybe everyone thought it sounded too much like pie in the sky and supply-side promises, and they had to be hard-headed and talk more about debt. I think debt polls better. in a way. People have a discount promises of growth, but the truth is you really do need pro-growth policies as well as spending restraint and as well as tax reform.
Well, I agree, and nobody in his or her right mind would say that we have a a maximally pro-growth tax code right now. We manifestly don't. But but before we get carried away, I think we should curb our enthusiasm by
1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, I know that's too much for me. We need to reflect for a minute on why this healthcare debate is so difficult. And here a little bit of history and even political philosophy is in order. Michael Walzer, who used to teach here, made a very interesting comment maybe 25 years ago to the effect that that in the medieval period, government was involved with the care of souls, but not of bodies. And in the modern age, it's just the reverse. And if you go back to the founding of modernity, the Cartesian promise that ultimately was the promise of immortality through science, that is now at the center of our public culture. The idea that we have it in our power not only to relieve pain and suffering, but to extend life itself, perhaps indefinitely. Now, if you have a firm enough belief in the afterlife, perhaps this isn't so important. But in current circumstances, where a lot more people profess to believe in heaven than act as though they believed it, the whole question of the extension of life is really central to social policy. It's morally central, and trying to alter the trajectory of these programs, which must be done in some way, shape, or form, it seems to me, is to ask people to make emotionally laden decisions about something that they regard as quite central. Now, that it's not mission impossible, but it's mission very difficult.
Well, another question, yes.
Okay, well, so my name's Mike Stope. I'm the interloper physicist here.
Good.
So apropos of Bill's remarks, and I should say Bill too, not as a matter of eminence, but as a matter of chronology, about the stranglehold that basically the establishment has on the selection of Republican candidates. I should say that the last time that the Republicans had a winning presidential ticket without the name Bush or the name Nixon on the top or the bottom was, anyone? 1928, 20 election cycles. I was at the Romney victory party on Tuesday night, and I have to say that from a physicist's point of view, and physicists don't typically even own neckties, I happen to have one. It was very much a country club type of group, in my opinion. The donors do hold on to a lot of what happens, whether the candidates turn out to be anti-establishment or establishment. The donors are really the motivating force. Even in Massachusetts, where the Republican Party is very much a second thought. Well, do you have any thoughts about how we get out of the? I mean, it's not just the candidates. There's something at a generic level which is forcing us into this, or I shouldn't say, at a grassroots level, at a country club, golf course grassroots level. Anyway, thanks.
I mean, look, I think Romney won the nomination fair and square, and didn't. I mean, he had a flawed field, and he clobbered Gingrich and Perry in certain ways, including on, I think I mentioned this before, on immigration, for which he ended up paying a great price on Hispanic votes. So I don't think the establishment simply has selected the candidates. I don't want to say that, but I do think donors. I mean, just in my personal experience, having been in and around Republican politics for about a quarter century, donors just seem more powerful today than they were. Partly it's the immense amounts of money and the super PACs. Money you can give to a campaign is limited, but the super PACs, and it's created all kinds of perverse incentives and perverse results, I guess, in terms of the influence some people have. I mean, the campaign reform is a classic example of the combination of poorly drawn legislation and then Supreme Court decisions, right or wrong, have ended up in a system that no one could possibly want. I mean, it really is insane to only be able to give $2,500 to a candidate and then spend $50 million, on a super PAC. I mean, either if you've disclosed, why not just give the money to the candidate? At least that way, if anti-establishment candidates like Gene McCarthy did in '68 could find a few wealthy donors, they could challenge the nominee of the party, and that's become, I think, a little bit harder. It also probably leads to an excessive reaction against it. So in my view, you have a little bit of the worst of both worlds now in the Republican Party, a Tea Party that is in a way too unmoored from certain sensible parts of the establishment, but in an understandable reaction against being dictated to so much by an establishment it dislikes, and you can end up with a little bit of the worst of both worlds. I don't know where it goes. I mean, the good news about America is it's such a huge country, and there's so many wealthy people, and they're all over the lot ideologically and intellectually, and so they can give money to every which strain of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And so there's a Clinton, there are Clinton Democrats and there are Obama Democrats, and there are people to the left of both of those, and there are conservative Democrats, and the same is true. There are Wall Street Democrats and anti-Wall Street, wealthy anti-Wall Street Democrats, and something of the same is true on the Republican side. I do think it distorts, I've seen this with politicians, the more time they spend with donors, and they do spend more time now with donors, relative to the time they spend with voters, I would say, it distorts their view of where the voters are. I mean, I've met with so many Republican senators who just gradually have convinced themselves that the entire public is pro-choice and kind of, in fact, cares, not only is pro-choice, but is really kind of rabidly pro-choice and really offended by any restrictions on abortion. And that's clearly not, we know where the public is. It's spread out, it's mixed, it's complicated on the issue, and it's somewhere between pro-choice and pro-life and sort of hostile to both extremes. Certainly Republican voters, though, and in some of these states are probably more pro-life. But they spend much more time hearing, I mean, you go to one of these donor things, the first question is always, when can we liberate the party from the Christian right? When can we stop talking about cultural issues? When can we be for same-sex marriage? And not just Mitt Romney, every Republican senator and congressman and candidate has heard that a million times. And I think it actually just distorts, you can like these positions rather than dislike them and say, well, maybe that's a good thing. It's pushing the Republican Party in a less ideological and a more enlightened direction. But I think it gives them actually a slightly bad reading on where the actual voters out there are. And I think it was really true of the Romney campaign. And I don't say this, again, I don't mean to say this disrespectfully. In the circles Mitt Romney moves in, it's Obama's management of the economy is horrible. It is terrible. We could have growth. And they're right, and I agree with them mostly on this. And they really can't believe that everyone else can't see this and how crazy Obama's policies are. And so just focus on the economy, the economy, the economy. Justice, Supreme Court appointments, cultural and social issues, foreign policy. I don't know, they're not so sure about that. So there's such a reinforcement from the donor world of a distorting focus, I think, at least in the Republican Party. I'm a little unclear in the Democratic Party how the donor world distorts things or doesn't. I do think here the Democrats in some odd way, in some way, are more in touch with their own voters, again, than a lot of Republican politicians.
Well, speaking of being in touch with your own voters, let me invite you, Bill, to do some counterfactual history, at least some counterfactual speculation. The decision by the Romney campaign to go to Rick Perry's right on immigration policy may have been the single most consequential decision that the Romney team made. It was a general election disaster. Question, was it a primary election necessity, or could they have done otherwise and survived?
I don't think it was a necessity, and I didn't think so at the time, but it's easy for me, who's not sitting there living and dying with the polls in Iowa and New Hampshire and then South Carolina and Florida, to say that they shouldn't have gone to Perry's right on immigration. I do think that most voters forgot, didn't remember until maybe the last few days, and they're reminded that, one of the centerpieces of a couple of Republican debates, I think it was 2 or 3 of them actually, was Romney hammering Rick Perry on in-state tuition for illegals. A totally nothing issue. I mean, this passed through the bipartisan way in the Texas legislature. No one in Texas, so that I know, cares about it. Something like 7,000 kids are benefiting from this. The huge majority of them are going to community colleges and local, sort of second-tier states, colleges in the Texas system, which they graduate, you understand, from Texas high schools. I mean, they're not like coming across the border to get these college scholarships. Their parents are undocumented. They're themselves undocumented. So, I mean, it's not, I don't even have a strong view. Maybe you shouldn't give them the same break that you give the legal residents of Texas to go to San Jacinto State University, but it's not really a huge issue. The universities actually want them. It's still money for them. It's better to have more kids than fewer from their point of view. Anyway, it was a non-issue in Texas, bipartisan support. And Romney just hammered Perry on it in the debates, and then hammered Gingrich. Remember this, when Newt said, in a slightly flaky way, something about, we should have some complicated program for people who've been here 25 years, will get treated differently from people who've been here 5 or 10 years. But the basic point Gingrich was making was correct. We're not going to deport people who've been here 25 years and have children and grandchildren in this country and say, "Soups, you're undocumented all this time, go back to Mexico or Guatemala or somewhere else." And Romney then hammered him on that. And I remember telling the Romney people I thought they were making A, it was just wrong and unseemly, and B, they just underestimated, I think, how much that would linger with Latino voters. I think most voters, it wasn't an important issue to them. It was just politics. They went out of their mind the moment the debate ended, and that was that. It had real, I think, resonance in the Latino community. And again, it wasn't because most Latinos, of course, the ones who were voting are by definition legal, and many of them don't know that much, probably don't even, I don't know how closely they follow immigration issues. They may not have that much of a personal stake in it, but I think it did become symbolic. It was the Republican Party. It just doesn't want, isn't even willing symbolically to be open-hearted or open-minded and what's the word I'm looking for? Open-hearted and good-natured about compassionate, right? Bush was helped a lot. Bush got 44% of the Latino vote. Romney got 27%. In reality, is Mitt Romney more hostile to Latinos than George W. Bush? I don't really think so. I think if you put them next to each other, they would have the same policies and the same sense of what should be done on immigration. But that's a pretty big drop-off in the vote. So I very much agree that that was one of the real prices they paid for a primary campaign. It's often what happens in primary campaigns, of course. It's one reason why you should avoid primary campaigns if you can, which again comes back to how Obama was helped by avoiding a primary. But I don't believe it was necessary for Romney to do that.
Part of the youth vote.
Hi, my name's Jim McGlone. I'm a sophomore here, originally from New Jersey. I spent the summer interning for my governor, and the last week or so, not at all happy with him. So I was wondering what you think his impact on the end result was with his actions over the last week or so, and what the effect of that will be on his future in the Republican Party. Because it seems like it worked out. He's a good opportunity for his re-election campaign next year, but what's his future?
I was annoyed at him, too. He went over the board, I thought, in praising President Obama for this great assistance with the storm, which may not have turned out to be so great, incidentally, if you see what's happening now in Jersey and on Long Island. But maybe that's just the way Christie is, kind of emotional, and he wanted to show he wasn't being partisan. And I don't think it mattered much, honestly. There's not much empirical evidence. These polls are complicated. They ask if you've decided in the last week. And I think that shows a decent number for Obama, but people notoriously lie about when they decided to vote. In the actual tracking polls, if you think about it, there's a tiny uptick in the midst of the storm when the president was presidential, a tiny actually drift down over the weekend. It's hard to believe it made much difference, I think. I think his future is, I think he did hurt himself, though, among Republicans. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to be, Christie, the Romney camp, I think, had issues at different times. I think Christie genuinely was critical of certain ways in which the Romney campaign was being run, but people do sort of expect if you're an elected Republican official, quite a prominent one, and a keynoter at the Republican convention, that you should be polite to the president. Of course, you can praise him for coming to your state. You can say you've had very good relations with the president and the federal government, and you appreciate what he's doing. The effusiveness of what Christie did rubbed a lot of Republicans the wrong way.
Now, for what it's worth, here's what the exit polls have to say about this. Here's the question, and I say for what it's worth because I honestly don't know, but the question is as follows. In your vote for president, how would you rate the importance of Obama's hurricane response? And people are given 4 possible responses: the most important factor, an important factor, a minor factor, or not a factor at all. 15% said that it was the most important factor. And of them, 73% went for Obama and 26% for Romney. And I think that Christie's effusiveness had some impact on the perception, the public perception of Obama's response. Among other things, the country is really sick and tired of the partisan bickering. People are responsible for what they detest, but still, with one part of their political souls, they're sick and tired of it. And so the sight of the guy who'd given the keynote address at the Republican convention and the president of the United States, whom he denounced, working arm in arm, was an attractive one. And I think it did move some votes. Now, having...
The one word on the exit polls, and Bill does this, this is why they're so unreliable. So if you took that literally, which Bill is using as an indicator,
right.
But if you took literally, think about it for a second, 15%, 75% of 73% of 50% would be means 50% of the electorate would be 10% had gone for Obama and
No.
5% against him in the last week. And of course, the polls don't suggest any 5% movement in the last
No,
week. So it's more of an indicator, I agree, of sentiment than an actual voting decision.
Right, it's qualitative and directional, it's not quantitative. But at the risk of, of I'm sorry?
Are you saying that qualitative is less exact than quantitative?
Yes.
For some purposes. For example, if the question is how much money do I have in my pocket, then the answer not much is less precise than, this is part of a long debate, blah, blah. So, but I think exact.
Which is not totally forgotten.
moving right along. At the risk of sort of rolling up my pant legs to my knees and wading into murky Republican waters, and I stand ready to be contradicted by one or more gentlemen to my left, or right, whichever, stage right. I think there is a history to Chris Christie's remarks, as follows. Number one, it has been widely reported recently that Christie believes that he was led on by the Romney campaign with regard to his vice presidential prospects. To be specific, he thought he was going to be the pick. He thought he was given reason to believe that he was going to be the pick. And apparently he resented the way the campaign handled that. That's point number one. Point number two, if you believe Christie, the Romney campaign vetted his keynote speech before he gave it, and then subsequently criticized him for the Christie-centeredness of the speech. And he resented that too. So you may have noticed that when Christie was asked to go across the river to meet up with Romney for a campaign in the Philadelphia suburbs, he refused to do so. And that generated another wave of resentment inside the Romney campaign. And since, Christie tends to meet resentment by escalating the resentment on his side, in order to be more resentful than any other resenter on earth, right? That's his modus operandi, and he's really good at it and quite engaging in the process. Then I think that the effusiveness that Christie showed towards the president in those waning days, in addition to being good for his reelection prospects in what is still, after all, a very blue state, represented some genuine emotion on his part, and the Romney campaign, may wish to reflect on that. What's left of it?
The buffet is set up, so let's go take advantage of it.
And the nursing home, and I think I know who's going to win that.
I agree. That wasn't
What it was is it was.
Not sure we want that. Well, I think we have a critical mass.
Yes, I think. And I was
We've been doing this for 30
exactly.
years.
That's what I
and you don't
said.
even know.
I was one of the first to come.
This is my aid in getting attention. I'm Shep Melnick from Boston College. I'll be moderating the second part of this program. And we'll have one slight change in procedure. Rather than require people to come up to the mic, I will just raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then you can go up and don't have to stand there for a long period of time. Andy.
Thanks, Shep. I wanted to ask a question about the obsession with data and polling during this election, and just. Sure. Thanks, Shep. I wanted to ask a question about the obsession with data and polling during this election, and to share an anecdote and to ask panelists to comment on it, which is that on October 3rd, I was at a friend's getting ready to watch the debate, and a colleague of his in the world of finance who had placed a pretty significant wager on the election had sent a text message to say that he had decided to go to the movies rather than watch the debate because Nate Silver had predicted that President Obama would win the election something like 79% to 21%, and I wanted to get your reactions to this whole phenomenon.
Well, who wants to go first?
Go ahead.
Well, you're the number cruncher.
Yeah, right. But I play one on TV. It's not entirely irrelevant that I have a son midway through an MBA program at the University of Chicago who is utterly fascinated with the Nate Silver phenomenon, because this represents the transposition of techniques that have been used in the private sector for a very long time, statistical techniques, into the world of politics. It is also the case, just, entre nous, that my son informs me, and I'm pretty sure he didn't make this up, that Silver got 49 out of 50 states right in 2008 and 50 out of 50 this time, and he informs me, called Florida pretty much down to the last tenth of a percentage point, which was no mean feat. And so we had a long discussion about this in his apartment, and he asked me why I had raised some questions about this consensus in advance of the election. And I said, well, I had an intuition that turned out to be wrong, that in fact, the likely voter models that were built into this consensus had underestimated turnout in some respects and overestimated it in others, and it turned out that was wrong. And he then proceeded to inform me that according to his Nobel Prize-winning professors at the University of Chicago Business School, that it was possible to feed all of those intuitions into a model and quantify them and come out with accurate results. Well, I have to say that given the record of the arch practitioner of this occult art in the past couple of cycles, I find myself on somewhat weak ground in arguing against it. But of course, like all techniques of this sort, it will be right until it's wrong. But for the time being, it's a combination of fascination with this application of advanced statistical techniques to politics, plus the fact that politics is a story. It's sort of like reading a book where you want to know how it comes out. And if somebody can give you a peek at the final chapter, by God, so this desire to know how it's going to come out is extremely powerful. And it's that desire that polls minister to say nothing of the fact that they're trying to create an aura of precision around a practice that probably can't be reduced to that level of precision, but within a particular portion of the sphere of politics, it turns out that more precision is possible than was previously imagined. And so there is a kind of a validation of this that's going on. That's the best I can do, but it's an interesting question you raise.
Well, but I mean, Silver was wrong in 2010. He said there's a 75% week out. He was still at 75% chance Republicans would win less than 50 seats, and they won
Right.
63. So, I mean, his model's no better than what he puts into it, and it's a very thorough model, and it's a bit of a black box, but it's basically, if the polls are right in general, and if you're not in a very volatile electoral environment, which was certainly the case this year, was an incredibly stable election when you look back, tiny little Romney rally after the debate, which ended up back where he started basically. The polls in general are more likely to be right. It wasn't just that Nate was right, it was the ABC Washington Post was right, a whole lot of polls were right. And the states thing isn't really very impressive. If you were going to have a 50-47 election, guess what? Romney was going to win the two tightest states from 2008 and might win Florida. I mean, that was perfectly conventional. Virginia was a point weaker probably than people thought. So I wouldn't overdo the precision. And look, some elections have more volatility in them than others. The reason people like us, I think, dislike the excessive focus on it is that it does seem to reduce deliberation to nothing, and it's just a matter of everyone voting their preconceived, either their sociology or politics is reduced to demography and sociology basically, and all the obsession on both the polling and on the demographic splits, does have a certain reductionist thrust. Now, some of that reductionism could be empirically true, but it's not entirely healthy for a democracy for everyone to assume that they can predict your vote based on your income or your ethnicity or your other sociological or demographical factors. And it gets a little overdone. I'm struck, I run into people, it's like, well, whites voted this way and Hispanics voted this way. Yes, but let's take Hispanics, who really were bad for, what were they, 73, 27? 27% isn't nothing, there's quite a lot of, and so it's a little oversimple, this kind of the way people categorize these whole groups and ignore the fact that, and it went from 44 to 27% in 2004 to 2012. Did the sociology or demography of Hispanics change that much in those years? No, so there was obviously a change in attitude. Now, we've discussed what caused that change to some degree. The Republicans went very anti-immigration in 2006, 2007, Romney did in the primaries, et cetera. So, now, that was then captured in the polls, so Nate Silver by October or September, October of 2012 could capture the change in Hispanic attitudes, but to the degree the demographic and sociological stuff prevents people from changing their mind about something, or seeing people tend to take it that way, I think one's right to push back against it a little bit. So you shouldn't give up on your argument with your son.
But in fact, but I'm not, I don't entirely accept that characterization of what he was doing, because he wasn't making arguments based on demography. He was making meta-arguments based on survey research, which is something a little different. Right. Bob Putnam is looking very troubled by all this.
We actually have two questions from two people.
I agree with that.
Analysis. He's done nothing like what you're describing this bill. Nothing like
I disagree with that. He's not. There are others who are equally sophisticated. Who's much more sophisticated? The people within the Obama campaign, actually. I mean, in this respect, Nate is making public what the Obama campaign figured out in 2008.
But you're saying that he's social economic truth?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that.
Not true.
No, I agree. He's a poll guy. No.
Quantitative prejudice in there, and that's not Nate Silver.
Well, I'm happy to embody anti-quantitative prejudice of all kinds, whether, but no, I agree. In his case, that's fair enough. I agree. I was making a broader point about, which maybe I should have made clear, is not a Nate Silver specific point, about the extent to which, though, people now do want to characterize the electorate in certain ways and sort of drive out determination in politics. I agree. Nate Silver is more of a classic, just take the polls and do a very sophisticated analysis of the polls and then predict the outcome.
Since we have one of the world's leading experts on survey analysis,
I'm glad to have a quantitative social scientist in front of me, the best there is of quantitative social science, but I don't want to get into that. I have a question which is different. I was a political scientist who's been studying this stuff for a long time, and as a citizen, I'm very partisan. I know who I want to win the election. As a political scientist, I like to think of myself as really being nonpartisan but interested in the process by which we come to our decision. And ultimately, the election, as it should, with lots of qualifications about how the Constitution and various things distort what the public votes for, nevertheless, ultimately, it's the voters who should come to a decision as to who should become president. And the thing that's concerned me about this election, and I wanted to ask you guys if you think my perception is wrong, is that this is the election in which it has been most difficult to find out the truth about anything, just because of the way in which the media operate, the way in which there are interpretations. What comes over on television is so unbelievable that if you're an ordinary citizen sitting there and trying to figure out what's going on, there are stories on both sides, both of which may be distorted, but in many cases only one of which is distorted, and it's very difficult to sort them out, in part because the media has eliminated the distinction between news and opinion to such an extent that you've got to be very sophisticated to figure out who can be believed. And so I'm wondering, is this something that it's existed forever in the 19th century, where it was the partisan press, and it's always been there, but I've gotten the impression that in the old days you had Brinkley and Huntley, you had Walter Cronkite, and they were sort of boring, but you could really believe in them. And now we can't find any place where you can really find good information that you can believe in. Is this going to change the whole way in which our elections are going to be run, and the extent to which they will be, in some sense, accurate and legitimate?
Well, I have views on that subject. I'm not sure how educated they are. First of all, I think everybody recognizes the truth of what you're describing, and there's a standard analysis that traces that to important changes in the media environment, the partial, though not yet complete, replacement of broadcasting with narrowcasting to niche political audiences, et cetera. So this is a familiar dynamic. I won't dwell on it. The question is whether it leads to quite as fact-free, opinion-laden situation as you say. And I listen to C-SPAN a lot. It turns out a lot of people do. And what they like about C-SPAN is that there's no commentary at all, right? Events are presented in full with no spin, no commentary. Obviously, somebody has to select which events to present, but C-SPAN is pretty good at creating a mix. And a lot of people repair to C-SPAN precisely for the reason that you cite. Many more people are downloading and reading for themselves government documents than used to be the case. So you get something, you lose something. So that would be my first point, that this environment, this technological and media environment, is more complex than the simple focus on narrowcasting would suggest. The second point is this, that I think in this election, but indeed in most elections, people are forming general impressions about the orientation of candidates. Whose side is X on? What does Y really care about? To what extent does Z have the kinds of capacities that one is looking for, and the kind of character, the kind of skill that one is looking for, for the next occupant of a particular office, whether it's the House, the Senate, the President, or what have you. And I'm struck, as my old friend Sam Popkin is, with the ability of the electorate to draw important and I think largely valid inferences from pieces of information which, considered in isolation one by one, might not be considered to be that impressive. And so, for example, if you look at the exit polls, people formed judgments about which strata of society the two major presidential candidates really cared about and whose interests they would try to serve. I think both candidates had a fair opportunity to put themselves forward to be judged along that dimension, along many others, and the people reached conclusions that I suspect you wouldn't dissent from. And so to the extent that one takes this thesis of low information rationality seriously, and I think one has to give it considerable weight, you'd have to say that what you're saying is true, but it's not the whole truth, and it may not be the dominant truth of the contemporary political process. Now, one last thing. Let me argue against myself. I'm really good at that. Playing both sides of the net is one of my favorite occupations. What is missing, and I've said this a couple of times in this debate already, is any sense of how people would move from the general commitments they have, which are different and I think accurately discerned, to the operationalization of policy pursuant to those general convictions. And that's why we were talking before the break about the absence of discussion on the fiscal cliff, so that no citizen, however assiduous, could really figure out on the basis of the presidential contest what a President Obama or President-elect Romney would actually put on the table and push for to address that problem. And I think that's a genuine shortcoming of the current environment. Whether it's a new shortcoming is a different question altogether.
It's a big question, and I don't go on too long, but there are two questions really. One is sort of, is the media environment or the media less good, less responsible, less informative than it once was? And the second is, does that, even if it is, does it affect what voters know? Does it affect the outcome of elections? And I guess I would say, on the second, I think there's very little evidence of that. I mean, if you look at past, is there more craziness in American politics today than when Joe McCarthy or George Wallace or Henry Wallace, I can do this on both sides, or Ross Perot or a lot of people emerged? I mean, we had a pretty moderate conservative candidate for the Conservative Party and a, kind of a moderate liberal or a liberal candidate who was forced to be a little more moderate maybe than he wanted to be for the Democratic Party. I think the huge majority of voters basically knew that where they were, basically, and where the two parties were. And I don't even quite agree. I mean, I understand your frustration that they never got into details on the fiscal cliff, but voters had the sense that Obama wanted a bigger government and Romney wanted a somewhat smaller one, that Romney would solve the fiscal problem by more cuts in reform of entitlements and cuts of entitlements, and Obama would prefer to raise taxes on the wealthy. They had the sense that, despite the lack of discussion at the Supreme Court, that if you cared about those issues, you had the sense that Romney would put on Roberts or Alito-type justices, and Obama would put on Sotomayor or Kagan-type justices. And so I think on most of the big issues, they had a decent sense. So I think if you actually compare it with the old days, I suspect voters had less information about candidates. They especially, certainly below the presidential level, incidentally, where people really could get away with just misleading voters, because there was no media that sort of called them to account, and you could be pro-life and think the guy you were sending to Washington was going to vote pro-life, and he wasn't, because there wasn't the kind of extensive media there is today. So I actually think, from the point of view of the elections, people are more informed and are kind of voting more rationally based on what their views are, perhaps than they used to, and are probably less subject to being simply demagogued or stampeded in some direction. The media thing is a very complicated. I'm less fond of the old days than you, perhaps, and more tolerant of the new, and I still would say that...
Oh, you're part of the new.
Well, I am, but I was part... I mean, I also grew up with the old, and I would say we would be appalled if we actually went back to the media environment of 1975. Let's just think what that world looks like. You have, if you don't live in New York or Cambridge, have out-of-town news to get the New York Times, you have one or two crummy local papers, which are often totally controlled by or in bed with particular interests. What do you have beyond that? 3 22-minute news shows a night, all produced within a mile of each other in New York and embodying center-left conventional wisdom. And that is it. That is it. No cable news, no talk radio, no internet, no access to any columnist unless your local paper happens to pick up one. And even that's a 70s phenomenon, really, with George Will and others. I mean, so people were amazingly lack knowledge about national issues, and I would say we're incredibly dependent on local establishments to give them the knowledge they thought they wanted to get. And that is why, guess what? We had, segregation in the South for many decades, which was very hard to break up until you had huge exercise of force majeure by the federal government. So I'm not quite as nostalgic for those old days. And I think when I go to college campuses, I think young people today know much more than we did. Because if they're at all interested, they can go online and not just read the government documents, but even so, they can at least read E.J. Dionne and Charles Krauthammer, and they can get a sense of the basic arguments on either side. And even if it means watching, Hannity and Rachel Maddow, it's not quite as high up as E.J. Dionne, I guess, and Charles Krauthammer, but you still get a sense of what the two sides or two parties want. Now, sometimes on some issues there aren't two sides, I understand, and they get oversimplified and all that, but I guess I'm a little more of a defender of the current information world from a civic point of view than some people are.
Well, if I can just add a word and then yield the balance of my time, which is probably negative to Sid. If you talk to voters, and ask them whether they have more or less confidence in their ability to size up the candidates and the parties than they used to, they report more confidence, as well they might, given political polarization, which makes it much more likely that the input in the form of your vote is going to produce an output in the form of a general direction of policy. This is, in a way, the 1950 American Political Science Association report's dream. I think it has some nightmarish qualities as well, but there is that kind of clarity. It's harder to get the basic direction wrong than it was 50 years ago, and for very good reason.
Can I just make one response to this? Because I asked the question sort of rhetorically, and I'm delighted with the answers. Let me just make 3 very quick points. I won't talk like you guys talk. golden ageism. You know, that back in the 19th century, everybody sat around the little fire pot in the general store. Everybody understood everything. I think we have now a much more informed public. And two other comments in that is a lot of what you're talking about how do we know what it is we're supposed to do in terms of policy to keep from going over the cliff, to use the word that maybe isn't the right one, is very parallel to what I think goes on in Washington, because no one is quite sure what exactly one should do about these very complicated issues. And the third point is simply that I, as a student of public opinion and how people work in politics, I'm a populist to some extent. And when people ask me, how can you read all this stuff about the public, they're so ill-informed, they behave so irrationally, I say, you're absolutely right. But Madison told us that the elite, the elected elite, are supposed to refine and expand what the public thinks. Look at Congress. You know, how much do they make a model of how democracy should work? So the public isn't so bad. But democracy still may work if they only let it.
I've started to develop a queue here. Actually, Bob Putnam is at the top.
This is not about fighting behaviors, but it is directed actually to Kristol. I was not here. I had a speech during the earlier session, so this may very well have been erased at that point. I'm interested in your sense of the fate of the plight of the Republican Party now. Not mainly on the demographic issue, the Latino issue, although I think that's a serious issue, but that's been lots discussed, but rather on the governization of the Republican Party over the last 8 or 10 years, something like that. That is to say, the increasing concentration of grassroots power in the hands of a group that has strong views, and they're welcome to it. I don't deny them, they have that right, but that are very far from the mainstream of the country. You probably know that although Tea Party is popular in some quarters, our data and other data has shown that among most Americans, it's incredibly unpopular. When you ask people how they feel about Tea Party, how they feel about Muslims and Mormons and atheists and so on, the Tea Party ranks below atheists in terms of opinion in America. On average, although it turns out that's very bimodal, as you can imagine. Same thing true for atheists. There are multiple reasons you could adduce for what the outcome of the election. You could call it sanity. That seems to me actually a really easy cop out. I hope Republicans, as a Democrat, I hope Republicans decided it was sanity, but I don't think it was sanity. You could call it the fact that they didn't listen to Jeb Bush on immigration. That seems to be a more serious claim. But I don't think any Republican candidate at all could have successfully navigated the rapids. I don't know if I'm a rafter. If you're a rafter, you've got to keep an eye on the river. The only way to get downstream is to go over to the very far right bank to get through the primaries. And then paddle like mad really quickly to get overboard toward the center. That is what happened to the Democratic Party, basically, for 20 years. And it kept the Democratic Party mostly out of office unless some horrendous thing happened by a Republican president like, Watergate. Are you worried the same thing may be happening in the Republican Party? That is to say that even the Democratic candidate screws up, the process of getting the Republican candidate has been so damaging. I allude to 5 Senate seats that would give you the majority in the Senate right now if it hadn't been for a screwed up primary electorate. You know the 5 I'm talking about, right?
I mentioned them earlier.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I wasn't here earlier, so I didn't know that. So I'm interested in your diagnosis of that. I say this because I actually wish that the Republican Party were a lot more competitive, actually.
Well, I think it's pretty competitive. I mean, It's pretty competitive. It does controls the House of Representatives. It got 48% of the vote in a presidential election. We're not talking Nixon McGovern here. It controls 30 governorships. I was the one who said, and you weren't here, that I'm worried about the party in various ways. Look, of course it's a problem, but Clinton solved the problem for the Democrats. Incidentally, there wasn't any big external cause for that. He was a gifted politician who could be liberal on some things and centrist on others, and was willing to take on parts of the base, while also, though, having strong parts of the base with him. That's doable in the Republican Party. I don't agree. I think Romney was particularly ill-suited to navigate that. He was too liberal, so he had to go too hard right, especially on immigration, and then it was awkward when he came back. Marco Rubio, Mitch Daniels, Jeb Bush, Scott Walker, Paul Ryan. I think there are plenty of Republican politicians who have now. I mean, how many Republicans are governors in states that are not automatic Republican states? They got themselves nominated. They're going to get themselves renominated. Look, it's delicate in either party, of course, both not to become captive either to the notorious base or the Tea Party, but also, you missed some of this, also not to become captive to the donor class or other particular special interests of a party. But I don't think it's unmanageable. I mean, I think it's a problem that needs to be thought about. I do think, unfortunately, and look, the best Republican election in 15 years, of course, was 2010, when the Tea Party was very strong. I think it is easier for Republicans to unite against big government liberalism than to unite on a governing agenda, which is why they did so well in 94 and 2010, and it's harder to do well at the presidential level. That is a big problem. And that requires, I think, some policy creativity, as was the case with Clinton. Less of a repudiation of one part of the party than the other, and ways of thinking about, well, to take Dodd-Frank. I think Dodd-Frank is probably bad legislation, but the alternative shouldn't be to be even nicer to Wall Street. The alternative probably should be, and we've published articles on this, to break up the big banks in accord with certain conservative principles of accountability and how finance should be run. So I think it's a little more of a challenge. I agree with that. But I'm not sure, the Democrats have had very comparable challenges, and you can imagine them having pretty big challenges. Yeah. So I guess I think we just need but I don't agree that Romney would have happened to anyone, in the sense that I think the worst thing you can be is be a moderate Republican who's distrusted, who then has to overcompensate to get the nomination, and then when you come back again, you do look as if you're something of a flip-flopper.
Look at the positions taken by the other people who didn't get the nomination. They would have been equally hard to sell.
Right, but it was a bad field, as I said before. But look, just in the states that are the matter, Bob McDonnell is the governor of Virginia. He won by 17 points. He's very popular in Virginia. Marco Rubio won the Senate race in Florida, starting out as a Tea Party candidate, defeating the incumbent governor who was running for Senate. I'm not saying it's automatic, but I think gifted politicians can navigate these rapids, to use your metaphor. And I would prefer to have a conservative populist Tea Party type who starts out, so to speak, there and moderates a little bit, than an establishment moderate, a wealthy type like Romney, who then has to figure out how to appeal to sort of the middle class, and it looks sort of clunky in doing so, and then tries to then reassure women that he's not terrible, and then we're into binders of women and all that stuff, and you end up slightly with the worst of all worlds, I think. Having said all that, it wasn't such a terror. He lost by 2.5 points. Let's not go overboard against an incumbent president. Incumbents usually win. I won't repeat all that stuff. So I'm a little less worried, I guess.
Well, let me pile on just for a minute. And that is, there are a lot of things I don't know much about. I talk about them anyway. One thing I do know a lot about is how the Democratic Party got from Dukakis to Clinton, right? And, and it didn't happen by accident, right? Not only was there an organizational base for the transformation, the Democratic Leadership Council, but a bunch of us shared a common analysis of the problem, were willing to talk about that analysis publicly, get a lot of unprintable substance thrown at us, being accused of being closet Republicans, et cetera, and finding someone, crafting a reform agenda, not just a sense that we have to move in one direction or another, but a concrete, specific reform agenda, and then finding a champion who had gotten to roughly the same place on his own, who happened to have the political skills and the moxie to sell that agenda and to take a lot of guff during the primaries in the process. And so I'm not saying that's the only way to change a party, But I think you'll find that if you look at the party-changing episodes in the Republican Party, there is a process. It doesn't just happen like that. And it requires some sort of organizational base. It requires a serious intellectual base, which, interestingly, I think Reform Republicans have. Right? There are a bunch of articles published in National Affairs, right, which would have served as the basis for a marvelous Reform Republican
why
agenda.
Romney-
And where were they?
Well, because Romney was, I think Mitch Daniels, I know for a fact, since I know they all read National Affairs in the Weekly Standard,
Right.
Mitch Daniels or Paul Ryan or others could have articulated that much better than Romney, who, whatever his merits,
But he
was
didn't
not
even
the
try.
type- Right, he didn't, because his campaign was so, he's not that type of kind of more intellectual politician. He's not a Clinton or a Mitch Daniels or a Paul Ryan. And B, he was so convinced he could win by a pure referendum on the economy, he didn't feel the need to try. If we come back in 2016 and the Republican field looks like the 2012 Republican field, and no one has tried to do what you say, I will totally agree that we have a huge problem. And I don't mean to minimize it even now. It needs to be done. It doesn't happen automatically. I just don't think that after, this one election, one can go so far. The other point I'd make, though, and this is a complicated one, and Bill knows this well from going through it on the Democratic side, what does it mean to sort of moderate? I mean, this is where it gets complicated. In a room like this, moderate means don't be pro-life, don't be against same-sex marriage, be, in accord with upper middle-class suburbanites, which is fine. They're an important voting bloc, and Republicans need to do better with them. That's where I live, Fairfax County, Virginia. I know exactly what positions would sell better with those people. But for every upper middle-class suburban woman in Fairfax who's put off by the fact that the party is kind of conservative on social issues, there's a working-class woman in exurban Ohio who, and you know this very well, Bob, who's socially conservative. Right, who is socially conservative and all this. So which way, is moderate be less free market and a little more Mike Huckabee, a little more, I think it could be. But then the donors go crazy. But I think in a funny way, the Democratic Party had a more straightforward path to the center in a funny way. I don't think you had quite the complexity of the sort of different forms of almost, they're cross-cutting cleavages in the Republican Party. Maybe they were equally hard in the Democratic Party, I don't know. But I'll just speak about the Republican Party. So that the normal kind of, why can't you guys be more moderate thing needs to be given substance, obviously.
That was not the question we asked ourselves.
Yeah, no, I know, I'm not saying it was, but don't you think the Republicans have it's a complex coalition, and therefore figuring out how to win, as you say, the primary with that complex coalition, and then win over some independent voters and Democratic voters, it might require even more political talent than Clinton. I mean, Clinton had an awful lot of talent. But as I say, I think Rubio Ryan et al. Might turn out to have the comparable level of talent.
More complex than trying to get the white working class back into
fair
the
enough.
Democratic Party at the same time you're trying to hold 95% of African Americans. That's why Sister Souljah took guts, right, et cetera. And,
No, that's fair enough.
Question here.
And I'm curious about the increasing polarization of American politics. If you agree that that's happening, and what your analysis would be of the forces underlying that, and then what solutions or suggestions or ideas you have for achieving a more bipartisan approach to, say, the economy in the congressional level.
I'll give 1 minute answer. I mean, yes, there's much more polarization. Every study shows that. It's not clear that's a bad thing. I mean, in 1950, the political science profession wanted to have clear choice among parties and didn't like James McGregor Burns, deadlock of democracy, terrible. You don't know neither party is responsive to anything serious, bunch of backroom deals in Congress. Now I agree with Sid, and this is the golden age when we had, think if we tried to go back to that. Let's not have open committee hearings. Let's have bills, it really is in a way shocking how I'm not for or against it, but in the modern world, you could not recreate the world of Congress in the 60s or the 70s, and maybe we shouldn't want to. So there is a lot of polarization. The parties are more like parliamentary parties in this respect, but since we have a presidential style of government with parliamentary parties, it creates some problems, and the main problem is what we've seen in the last 4 years, or 2 years. But I'm a contrarian and a minority, and I could well be wrong. I'm somewhat optimistic. And I believe that we will actually have a lot of legislation in 2013 and 2014, and that the gridlock will be broken. So I think the gridlock was not a metaphysical product of the nature of modernity. I think it was the product of one simple thing. Obama won a pretty big victory in 2008, and the Democrats had won big victories in 2006 and 2008. They thought they had a mandate to take the country in one direction. The Republicans won a very big victory in 2010, a huge off-year election, and they thought they had a mandate to stop the Democrats minimally from taking the country further in that direction, and in fact to go back in the other direction. Well, guess what? I think any political scientist or historian would, given those facts, say there's probably not going to be a lot of agreement on legislation, and the bodies are split. The Democrats control the Senate, the Republicans control the House, and there's a presidential election coming up. And I think most of us would agree that there wouldn't be much legislation passed in 2011 and 2012, and there wasn't. This will be I do think in this year we will get some version of a budget deal. We will get Bowles-Simpson in an Obama-esque direction, which isn't what I would prefer, but we will get it. Whether it's a real deal, whether it solves what Mike talked about earlier in terms of the real chasm ahead, whether it papers it over for 2, 3, 4 years, another question. But there'll be some biggish deal, I would think, on that. I think there's a pretty good shot of getting immigration through in 2013. I think the president will get his Supreme Court nominees confirmed. So all the kind of classic, gee, we're in total meltdown, and we're having the bitterest Supreme Court nomination hearings ever, and we can't pass a budget. I think a lot of that stuff will end. I think Boehner's got a very dicey hand to play and genuinely tough decisions to make. He'll be in a very interesting position. But I guess so I think the gridlock argument might be an overgeneralization of from the last couple of years, which had a peculiar character.
Right, but the polarization argument isn't. And as Bill has already said, and I run the risk of going on much too long in answer to your question because I've spent roughly the past 7 years of my life studying precisely that question. And let me give you a 2-minute version of my grand theory of everything. And that is that, in the late but apparently unlamented golden age, the two political parties basically agreed on fundamentals. Here's what I mean. After Eisenhower, dragged the Republican Party kicking and screaming into accepting modern republicanism, which meant making one's peace with the New Deal, we essentially had, by the 1960s, two Keynesian political parties. There were liberal Keynesians and cheap Keynesians, but there was a common frame of reference, right? On foreign policy, there was Cold War anti-communism, which was the common property of the two parties, such that in a famous experiment, when the transcript of the Kennedy-Nixon debate was presented to students with the names of the speakers obliterated, they couldn't do better than random in guessing who was saying what. And if they thought, and to the extent that they erred in believing that the more dovish of the two must be Kennedy, they made a big mistake, because in fact the reverse was the case. And then on cultural and social issues, there was a duopoly of silence, right? There was an agreement to keep as many of those issues as possible off the agenda. And then we spent 15 years from 1965 to 1980 living through a series of events that destroyed those common frames of reference between the political parties. And I could go through the history of those 15 years and show you how two Keynesian parties were supplanted by a Keynesian party and an anti-Keynesian party, how two Cold War anti-communist parties turned into one Cold War anti-communist party and one party that had grave misgivings about that, and how this duopoly of silence gave way to a raucous public debate about all the social and cultural issues that previously had been kept off the agenda. That's what happened. And we've been living in the aftermath of that 15 years of history for the past 30 years. And the question is, what is to be done? And I don't think we can run the reel of history backwards. The question that I and some other people have been asking, are there feasible institutional reforms within the Congress of the United States which would enable it to function better in the context of the development, and here I entirely agree with Bill, of two quasi-parliamentary parties? And a group that I've been working with, a tripartisan group of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents called No Labels, has actually spent the past year thinking through that question. If you go to nolabels.org, you'll find about 20 institutional and procedural proposals, all designed to make polarization somewhat less likely to produce gridlock. We're not going to undo polarization. We can mitigate it, but we can, in Madisonian fashion, use institutions to mitigate its consequences, even if we can't reduce the phenomenon itself.
Danilo Petronovich, kind of predictioneering question
Oh, no.
for you, I guess. I teach a course over the last couple of years, two falls ago and last fall, in my American politics seminar at Yale. All of my students seemingly wanted to write about Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street, protest movements and protest parties. It was all the rage, all the interest. It seems to me over the last 6 to 9, maybe 12 months, the Tea Party has kind of disappeared, or perhaps they've just shut up in order to try to
defeat Obama. So my question is there a comeback in the cards? Because, you know, the healthcare reform is going to be implemented now over the next few weeks and months. What is your prediction? Will the Tea Party make a comeback or not? Or will it just disappear? Because of the election, because of, you know, loss of momentum and whatnot. I don't know, Occupy Wall Street is probably a little less interesting. I think I know what you're going to say about that. But
No, you might not. I mean, I'll say something briefly. I think Michael has thoughts on the Tea Party too. He probably wants to chime in. Look, one price we paid for the old system, the duopoly, is when you have a sort of protest populist movement that's unhappy with it, it goes a little, it's wacky. I mean, well, it goes in, it rose in the 60s. I mean, Goldwater in 64, McGovern in 72. I mean, so everyone looks back on that. That was the era when everyone worked things out, except in fact in both parties there was total turmoil. And in fact, both parties, the establishments were overturned, and we ended up with the politics we have. One of the big advantages of the current system, and one of the huge advantages of federalism, and the ability to have primaries at the local and state level, which produces some wacky Senate candidates who then lose, though the establishment also produced a lot of bad Senate candidates who lost in this cycle. But the biggest advantage of it and this is really not a Republican point, but I think a kind of civic point, is that it channels the people into the party system and into more established political channels, which I think on the whole is a good thing. And I think it's happened in both parties, in a sense, you could argue. And if you would ask a historian, huge financial crisis, total collapse, almost world economy on the brink, Wall Street terrible, Washington totally dysfunctional, immigrants, big fights about Hispanics, two difficult wars. What's American politics going to look like? I think the prediction will be what it will look like is sort of the 60s. It'll look like George Wallace and Barry Goldwater and on the right and people in the street on the left and a lot of craziness and certainly on the right, xenophobia and all the, and Fortress America, Pat Buchananism. In fact, what's amazing about the last 4 years is, and I think this is a testimony to the current political system, actually, is it absorbs a lot of protest and a lot of forces, first African-American president, first Mormon nominated, and the whole system sort of chugs along, and the people aren't having a heart attack, and there's not anti-Mormon protests on the street, and they're not anti-black protests on the street. I mean, it really is sort of impressive. And so I don't think the Tea Party is gone by any means. I think there will be a Tea Party, there is no one Tea Party, but there will be Tea Party sentiment that will reemerge now. There'll be 18 competing narratives, as we say, of what went wrong with the Republican Party, and one of them will certainly be a sort of Tea Party narrative about this is the last time we nominate a rich guy from Wall Street who's the son of a governor, and et cetera, and maybe it will be the last time, I don't know. I personally would sort of have had enough with all due respect to Mitt Romney and all due respect to George W. Bush, enough like Romneys and Bushes, and maybe we could nominate, Marco Rubio or Paul Ryan or Bobby Jindal or someone like that, but you never, I can say it, but maybe it won't happen. I think the Tea Party sentiment is deeper, though, and at its best, actually, is a very, if you're a conservative, a heartening sentiment in the country and an impressive civic thing. I mean, in a way, again, think what happened in the last 6 years, though, for all the problems of the political system. We had a huge movement of mobilization in the Democratic Party, a peaceful one, a civic one that ended up beating Hillary Clinton with an African-American, less than one-term senator from Illinois, who then won the election. We had a huge civic mobilization in the Republican Party that led to helped lead to the winning of 63 seats in 2010. In both elections, involvement was up, participation was up. I mean, now the one price you pay for that is maybe a little more, if you're in the establishment of either party, you're not entirely happy about this. But from a civic point, from a Bob Putnam point of view, I don't know, this is not such a bad system. I mean, this doesn't look like apathy. It doesn't look like individualism in the Tocquevillian sense. It doesn't look like people feel they can't influence the system. So in that respect, I would argue, and this is sort of a broader discussion, that the flip side of what people don't like about current politics, one really needs to think hard about whether it's also allowing some pretty encouraging and impressive things to happen. I mean, the fact that Romney is the nominee, the Protestant Party in the United States, nominated a Mormon and a Catholic this time. The Democratic Party in the United States nominated and renominated and obviously reelected an African American. Marco Rubio, I won't even go through all the diversity in both parties, but I mean, it's not even commented on, really, that, that both parties are actually pretty impressively diverse, and not in the Republican case, and really not in the Democratic case either, because of top-down insistence on quotas. You can't do that in primaries, really, right, and in elections. But people just, emerged and got nominated, and I think that's a pretty impressive aspect to the current system.
Well,
what's that? Policy? Well, policies.
Policy problems that face the country.
Well, we're getting to that. We're getting to that.
But that's where things get interesting. Mike, why don't you go first, and then
I
I
always prefer
have.
to talk policy, but I was going to address the question, which is about the Tea Party, and just make this sort of historical observation that at times in American history, we have these competing governing political parties, and they have a lot in common. One of the things that they have in common is that they like to wield power from the center, and they make coalitions with people who have economic power, both corporate and labor, and sometimes other centers of power like universities and others. And then there are times when the periphery begins to believe that it's getting abused. And in the 18th century, I think it was David Hume that attached the label of the country party and the court party to this. And at that time, the court party wasn't that one of them was Whig and one of them was Tory. It was that the people in power among both the Whigs and the Tories were the court party, and then you had a country party, which is a sort of inchoate, out of power. But people who, a lot of what they said was very crazy. The Cato's letters people and Bolingbroke and so forth. Our founders were reading the country party and imbibing it, and very much the spirit of our revolution, and to some extent, not as much as the revolution, but to some extent, even the Constitution is with this. And there are times in history when we divide into court and country parties, which cut against Democrats and Republicans. I see the Occupy people and the Tea Party as having a great deal in common with each other, and as elements within the country party. What they see is a Washington which is governing in the interest of the ruling class. They see that Goldman Sachs mysteriously runs the economy, whether it's George W. Bush or Barack Obama. It doesn't seem to change. They see that Dodd-Frank actually benefits the big banks, right? It doesn't hurt the big banks. It doesn't, and I personally believe that the Occupy folks are less shrewd in their diagnosis, but my goodness, they're right in their basic message. Young people are well and royally screwed, right? They are coming into an economy where they have massive debts, where their opportunities are limited, where the elite, the dominant court party in Washington, has laid a $16 trillion debt upon them. They're going to have to pay either in the form of less services, higher taxes, or inflation, or one way or another. They're the ones who are going to have to pay, right? They have been dealt a very bad hand, and the Tea Party sees almost the same thing, even though, obviously, left, right, there's big differences there. But I think that, you ask, is the Tea Party going to survive? And is Occupy going to survive? I think as long as the two parties in Washington continue to rule in the combined interests of themselves and the already powerful, they are going to survive, and they're going to become more powerful. And my guess is that they, maybe not in the current form, because I don't really know what the Tea Party is. There's not a single thing out there. Maybe it'll be called something else. Who knows? But I don't think it's going to actually go away until Washington changes its tune, and that requires the Democrats and the Republicans both to change the way they've been doing business, because this is not a unipartisan crisis that we're in. This is a genuinely bipartisan crisis. Now, whether bipartisanship is going to solve the crisis, I don't know what's going to solve it. I'm a bit of an optimist in that I think it is so bad that that anybody, no matter how, if you're a Democrat, I think even, Boehner is going to have to see that you have to do something. If you're a Republican, I think even Obama is going to have to see we have to do something about this problem. It's so bad. That makes me, I think it's so bad that it makes me a bit of an optimist. But I don't think that the Tea Party is going to go away until something is done to redress this imbalance. It is shocking that in a democratic republic, the richest community in the nation is Washington, D.C. Isn't that shocking? I mean, something has gone seriously wrong.
And now for a word from the establishment. First of all, I would say thank God, that when James Madison sat down to think about the Constitution, he focused a lot more on David Hume than on the Country Party. Now, granted, without the Country Party, there might not have been a revolution to constitutionalize. So I'm not, I'm not making a one-hand clapping argument, but I do think that there are limits to populism, and populism in the American tradition often shades over into dysfunctional paranoia, and you don't have to be Richard Hofstadter to believe that. And I would argue that a lot of the populism on both sides in recent years has been a pretty good example of dysfunctional paranoia. They may be legitimate grievances, but they are not being articulated legitimately in my judgment. That's point number one. Point number two, we're going to get a chance to put this to the test pretty darn soon, okay? The fiscal cliff, whatever you think of it, is real, okay? Query, will leaders who know what needs to be done be allowed to do what needs to be done? And, the wings of the two political parties that you're celebrating, Mike, are the major forces opposing what needs to be done.
That's just not true in the Republican case.
Well, who the hell kept John Boehner from making a deal, and who kept Barack Obama from making a deal? It was the organized wings of the two political parties who. And let me make one other point, and then you can both pile on me. This idea that the government that we have is some conspiracy foisted on the people, I think, is demonstrably false. A better guide to the government we now had is offered by some of the concluding paragraphs of Plato's Gorgias. When Socrates asks people to imagine how the democratic polity will respond to a political competition between a physician and a pastry chef. And Socrates opines that the pastry chef is going to win every time. If you ask me why we're in the situation we're now in, it's because one party has spent the past generation telling people that they can afford all of the programs that they favor without tax increases, and the other party has spent the past generation making the argument that we can cut taxes indefinitely and there won't be any consequences. This is madness, but it's populist madness.
I think it's just look, I'm not going to defend all populism. I'll say 2 points. It's just a caricature of the Republican Party. The Paul Ryan budget actually forced the Republican Party to pass a budget that cuts Medicare and that reforms Medicare in a pretty fundamental way, in a way that was supposed to be undoable, and resisted a demagogic attack on it from President Obama. That's a pretty big achievement. And the Tea Party people were for that. They don't believe that you can have the current system go on and you can get all the benefits you want. And in fact, Ryan doesn't even emphasize, doesn't have a net tax cut particularly in his plan. So,
what about a tax increase?
No, well, he doesn't believe we need a tax increase.
Well,
or at
if you
least
don't
he's
believe we need a tax increase, then you can't get to yes with the fiscal cliff.
Well, that's not clear.
It's totally
not
clear.
clear that
That's
you need
the
an
heart of
increase
the
in
matter,
tax
Bill.
rates.
It's totally clear.
It's not clear, A. And B, in any case, the establishment Republicans are no more open to that than Ryan. Anyway, from a fiscal point of view, Paul Ryan has been more responsible, I would say, than the great establishment Republicans who were there before the Tea Party, unless you think Bush was just wonderful and the Congress was great under Denny Hastert or something like that. The Tea Party's been a force for fiscal responsibility. Will they, incidentally, the Tea Party's not even particularly hard over on taxes. It was very much of a spending-oriented party movement, and I would not be surprised if they would accept a deal if it really got serious about spending. Secondly, I do think this is something liberals should think about. There are two kinds of many kinds of populism, but two obvious strains. Healthy, let's call it, and nasty. I would say on the Republican side, on the Republican side, I'm making this kind of simple, on the Republican side, people should be great. It could get much worse. There's a few people, the fact is we've had a pretty big populist Tea Party movement, the Republican Party, that has not been the people pushing for on the whole, hostility to immigration. I mean, Palin was good on immigration. Perry and Gingrich, the right-wing candidates, were to the left of Romney on immigration. The anti-immigration people are scattered all over the place. Some of them are Tea Party connected. Some of them are talk radio connected. That's a little different. But in any case, that fiasco was in 06, 07. But the truth is you have a Tea Party that's fairly internationalist, that doesn't, I mean, the famous Palin, Gingrich, Santorum, who do you want to be the Tea Party guys? They're not xenophobic. They're not particularly hardline on immigration. They're not for cutting out foreign aid. They're not they're not objecting to having a Mormon and a Catholic as the nominees of the party. This is not, I mean, of all the kinds of populism that could grow up, the conservative populism has been reasonably healthy, I would say, for the last 3 or 4 years. And I would say the same is true in a lot of the liberal populism. What worries me, and this I think is sort of just, I don't know what's going to happen, but if you did have a double-dip recession, or if you really have a war go very badly and sort of retreat in disgrace from Afghanistan in a sense that the lives that were all lost weren't worth it, and other things go wrong around the world, you could easily get a Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul type populism. One of the achievements of the Republican Party, out of a lot of the Tea Party leaders, including Rubio, I would say, but Palin in her own way even, I wouldn't want to ever come to Harvard without defending Sarah Palin at least once, have channeled the Tea Party in a reasonably sensible way on a lot of big issues. They may not be quite where you want them to be on the fiscal cliff, but on a lot of other things, they're not where traditional right-wing populism has been. I am personally worried. I mean, I think everyone talks about Rubio, Ryan, all these guys as candidates for 2016. You can imagine a set of events which makes Rand Paul a leading Republican candidate in 2016. That is something I would be very unhappy about. And I think thinking about that and the failure of Ron Paul, incidentally, in 2012, reminds us that there are very different strands among populists and among the Tea Party. I'd say the same about the Democratic Party, where there have been many, populists who've been constructive, if not quite in agreement with the establishment. But there's a kind of populism that could really go off the rails. And I am worried, actually, with Obama being reelected, if you really had a bad set of developments in this country, you would have the equivalent of the Joe McCarthy, George Wallace type of populism, which you really haven't had much of, honestly, I'd say, on the right in the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, Bill's comments inspire me to segue a little bit more into the policy side of this question. Just two comments to Bill. One, we're talking about the impossibility of doing this without raising tax rates.
No, that's not what I said. Revenues, not tax rates.
Okay, well,
Statically scored revenues.
Thank you, because that was actually the correction I was going to make. I think you said rates, and I was going to
No,
remind you of your own position not long ago, which I agreed with, in response to my suggestion that we might actually need to institute a VAT.
Let's argue about what we really disagree with.
That it is possible to raise revenues while still having lower tax rates.
Of course it is.
That, of course, was the Republican position in this election, ridiculed uniformly by the left as being impossible. But I think we agree. So that has to be part of the solution. Okay. That's not going to be, it'll be hard to work out the details of that. But I think if the two parties cannot get together on that, we are in dreadful circumstances. The other point is that even with respect to increasing rates, it is true that Republicans are saying no, no, no. But I would like just to remind you of basic negotiating tactics, right? People do not go into a negotiation having already conceded what they're going to the other side. The Democrats, of course, are going to say that they're taking a hard line on reforming entitlements. The Republicans are going to say they're taking a hard line on no tax rate increases. And I have no idea what's going to come out of it, but I don't believe either of them and I don't mean they're lying, I just mean they are using standard negotiating techniques that you go into a negotiation not having already conceded. And so I'm not as pessimistic that there isn't going to be room for compromise just because right now, people are positioning themselves. We are in such a dreadful situation. What we need to do is we need to run the numbers on the tax reform, find out how much revenue we can get in this fashion that you and I agree upon. I'm guessing it's not going to be enough, and we're going to have to figure out how much spending. My memory of this is that Joe Biden was able to come up, negotiating with the Republicans, was able to come up with, I think it was $1.2 trillion in spending cuts that they could agree upon over a 10-year frame. That's probably not enough either.
Certainly isn't.
But we begin to, and then we find out how much is left, right? And that has to be, I don't think we need to get to a balanced budget. I'm of the view that as long as we stay with the gap lower than the expected long-term increase in economic growth, we're okay, right? That's going to be the hard part, and the parties, of course, are not going to admit in advance that they're going to give in, but they're both going to have to give in to some extent. If not, we are truly heading for disaster.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope you're right, because that's what needs to happen. But back to the Tea Party for a minute, since that was the question that sparked this very interesting colloquy. I've had the opportunity to be part of a team that's collaborated on putting together a couple of very good surveys on the Tea Party. Not the leaders, the rank and file. And I will send you those surveys, Bill, so that you can judge for yourself whether the questions were fairly posed and the answers accurately analyzed. Let me just report to you that the anti-immigrant positions that the members of the Tea Party expressed in both of those surveys were more intense than the standard anti-immigrant positions in the Republican Party. So the idea that the Tea Party is some sort of benign force with regard to what we both agree needs to be the immigration policy going forward, I think is not right. And we have to ask a question that you and I talked about before the break. What was it that led Mitt Romney to the judgment that he had to go to Rick Perry's right in order to win the Republican nomination with respect to immigration policy? I think that they were looking at the grassroots activists in the Republican Party and making a judgment as to what would possibly sell. And who are those people?
Right, so that's why Newt Gingrich wins South Carolina, the more conservative state, and Mitt Romney wins Florida. No, Mitt Romney went to his right. This was a cheap political thing, which he was able to sell to a lot of people at the grassroots of the Republican Party. Not just, I mean, you just want to characterize every policy you don't like as a sort of Tea Party policy, and every conservative policy is Tea Party, and then use the Tea Party so vaguely. I take your point about surveys of, quote, Tea Party activists. That might be.
Tea Party identifiers.
Okay, but it would also, you could also find a lot of I mean, I don't know what the exact questions were, but you can find a lot of distasteful positions if you survey different activists of different identifiers of other interest groups.
I agree with that, too.
The actual elected officials who are the, quote, Tea Party leaders have, it's just as a matter of actual fact, I believe, are not on particularly right-wing on the immigration issue.
We actually have time for one more question, Gavin.
Great, thanks. Gavin Dowell, and mine's a little more tactical about, well, it's a little bit separate to some of the questions I've had, and it goes to Citizens United. I had an article in the New York Times, it got a little bit of press, that reported that an employer, a relatively small business employer, about 7,000 employees, sent out a notification to his employees that if Romney won the election, he would shut down his company, and everyone would lose their job.
You mean Obama?
No, if Romney, if Obama won, sorry.
Thank you.
And there was a report that said that this would not have been allowed prior to Citizens United. So my first question is that factually accurate? And I think, Judge McConnell, I turn to you for that. But the second is, we've talked about the super PACs are the obvious outcome of Citizens United. We talked a lot in the first session about what they did or didn't do well. What did Citizens United open up that hasn't been explored yet that we're going to see in the next cycle because people have time to analyze it more? Or is really super PAC all there is to it? So,
well, let me address the first. I haven't done any legal research on this. There's nothing in BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, that has anything to do with an employer sending a letter to his employees. The electioneering is defined in terms of broadcast communications, and sending a letter to your employees would not be a broadcast communication and thus would not be covered. What it might be covered by is labor law and I don't think Citizens United has anything to do with that. There's also going to be a distinction between whether an employer is making a threat or whether the employer is informing that a threat with respect to any individual person. If you vote, if an employer were to say, if you vote for Obama, I will do X, that's different from telling them, look, if Obama's elected, we're going to, let's say I'm a medical device manufacturer, we're going to be hit with a 2.5% revenue tax on medical devices, I'm going to have to shut down. That's telling them, they may be exaggerating, it may be wrong, it may be distorted, but it's not a threat. It is a politicized statement about what's going to happen. So it's not, so that's one distinction, and then labor law is another layer of this, but it has nothing to do with the campaign finance laws. Now, as to your second question, the inventiveness of the of money going into politics is so extraordinary that we have certainly not seen everything yet. I don't know, and if I knew what it was that's coming along, I would resign my position at Stanford and go become an election consultant because that's where the money is. But I don't know, but I'm sure we're going to see lots more. The super PACs actually are not a creation of law. They grew up in a regulatory, in the interstices of the law, and it's a regulatory glitch that people are exploiting. It's not even created by Citizens United. It's created by a D.C. Circuit decision, which didn't even need to cite Citizens United. It really relied upon Buckley against Vallejo, the decision from 1976. So, there's a lot. Well, there is a lot more in store. I mean, I think trying to regulate campaign finance is a fool's errand. It's never going to be successful, and it has a whole lot of unfortunate, unintended bad side effects, like the one we were talking about before dinner, where the party that has a primary is disarmed for the summer, which nobody ever voted for that. That's a completely unjustifiable glitch, which, if Bill was right in his analysis, may have been the thing that determined who was elected president of the United States.
We've reached the end of our hour, so I'd like to thank the participants very much, and we'll reconvene in 2 years.
Good to see you.
Mike?
Great fun. I think if you and I could be